Next, a look into policing practices. We'll hear from law enforcement officials and police reform advocacy groups who spoke before the House Judiciary Committee. They'll talk about ways to improve police relations within the community and increase accountability among law enforcement. This is 3 hours and 40 minutes.
The House Committee on the Judiciary will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. We welcome everyone to this morning's oversight hearing on police practices. Before we begin, I want to briefly recognize Susan Jensen, whose last day on the committee after more than 20 years of service is tomorrow. Susan is highly respected on both sides of the aisle as one of the preeminent experts on bankruptcy, administrative law, and the federal court system. It is a testament to her knowledge and fairness that she worked as a counsel and later senior counsel for both Republican and Democratic chairs of this committee. First hired by former Chair Henry Hyde for her expertise in bankruptcy law, Susan later moved to the Democratic staff under former Chair and Ranking Member John Conyers, where she expanded her portfolio to include administrative law, the federal courts, and ethics issues. When I was elected to serve as chair, I also asked Susan to serve as the committee parliamentarian, in addition to her other duties. In that capacity, she has worked on nearly every facet of Judiciary Committee operations, including preparing committee reports and working across the aisle to develop procedures for hearings, markups, and other committee activities. Regular viewers of this committee will recognize her as the person sitting behind me, providing me wise counsel. Susan has been essential to the operations of this committee, and she has been involved in nearly every piece of committee business over the last year. Although she will be leaving the committee, she will continue in public service as she transitions to a position with the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts. I wish her well, and I thank her for all her years of service to this committee. I now recognize the ranking member for any comments he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad we start off. Again, there's so many things we do agree, and this is one. And as you just mentioned a minute ago, the two of our faces are on this screens of America a great deal. The greatest part about it is Susan being behind us to soften the blow and to make sure that I behave. Sometimes she'll disagree that she could do that, make you and I work together, but she's been amazing to work with. Sometimes people don't know. They know our faces, they know the members, but they see these folks behind us. These folks behind us on both sides are amazing. The staffs of Democratic and Republican members have to put up with us, which is amazing to start with. But in a committee role like this, Susan, you have been a friend. You're probably the one that I hear the name most often. When I say John, he says, well, Susan called and did it. I said, well, was I in trouble? And she said, no. But Susan, you're going to be missed. And it'll be hard to turn around and not see you here, but I am so happy for you. The beneficiary here is what you've done for the committee, but also what the Administrative Office of the Courts is going to do. They're gaining, we're losing, and we acknowledge that. With that, I yield back to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Thank the gentleman for his comments. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. Today's hearing furthers our committee's longstanding commitment to conducting meaningful oversight of state and federal law enforcement, as initiated by former Chairman Goodlatte and his establishment of the Bipartisan Policing Strategies Working Group. Together, we have had productive conversations about improving relations between law enforcement officers and the communities they serve. And today we continue that important discussion. Without question, the vast majority of law enforcement officers serve honorably under difficult conditions, often risking and sometimes losing their lives to protect us. There have been, however, a disturbing number of incidents of excessive force used by police against civilians, many of whom were unarmed, most of whom were people of color, and many of which resulted in tragic death, that have put incredible strain on the relationship between law enforcement and their local communities. For example, on July 17, 2014, 5 New York City Police Department officers attempted to arrest Eric Garner, a 42-year-old father of 6, for allegedly selling loose cigarettes by tackling him to the ground and placing him in an illegal chokehold. He repeatedly told the officers, "I can't breathe." The officers ignored his pleas as he slipped into unconsciousness and death. No one was held criminally responsible for Mr. Garner's death. We are fortunate to be joined by Mr. Garner's mother, Gwen Carr, and I say to you that the criminal justice system and the justice system failed you, your son, and your entire family. Shockingly, the officer responsible for placing Mr. Garner in a departmentally banned chokehold remained on the force for 5 years before being finally fired this past August. On September 9th, 2015, James Blake, an African-American professional tennis player, was standing outside the Grand Hyatt Hotel in Midtown Manhattan when Officer James Frascatori, for no apparent reason, charged him, wrestled him to the ground, and placed him in handcuffs. New York's Civilian Complaint Review Board, an independent agency that reviews complaints of police misconduct, determined that Frascatori used excessive force and recommended that the officer be punished with departmental disciplinary charges that could lead to suspension or dismissal. Instead, his only punishment was to lose 5 vacation days. Mr. Garner's death and the assault on Mr. Blake, both at the hands of police officers sworn to preserve and protect, and serve, I should say, should alarm all Americans, regardless of party, regardless of political ideology, regardless of race, religion, or gender. This is not a partisan issue. There are no sides. Too often, the discourse on police misconduct descends into a false dichotomy of us versus them. Black lives versus blue lives versus black lives. This is a false and dangerous dichotomy. The United States stands as the world's greatest experiment in self-government. The legitimacy and authority of our nation's government rests upon the consent of its people, we the people. This principle particularly applies to law enforcement, which has been given the authority to use deadly force under color of law. There can be no doubt, unfortunately, that communities of color perceive law enforcement as a threat to their everyday freedoms. These perceptions go back decades, predating both the 1994 Los Angeles riots and the 1965 Watts riots, both of which were sparked by a lack of accountability for incidents of police brutality. These perceptions are reality for African Americans. According to the Center for Policing Equity, African Americans are 2 to 4 times more likely than white Americans to have force used against them. For far too long, however, pleas for more just and humane treatment from law enforcement have often fallen on deaf ears. Claims of police misconduct coming from communities of color have often been ignored or not believed. But Mr. Garner's killing and a series of other examples of police misconduct against African Americans, many of which were caught on video, make it unmistakably clear that claims of police misconduct are all too often real. To list just a few, on August 5th, 2014, John Crawford was shot and killed by a police officer in a Walmart store in Beaver Creek, Ohio, for holding a toy BB gun. On August 9th, 2014, Michael Brown, who was unarmed, was shot and killed by police in Ferguson, Missouri. On November 22nd, 2014, 12-year-old Tamir Rice, who was unarmed, was shot and killed by police in Cleveland, Ohio. On April 2nd, 2015, Eric Harris, who was unarmed, was shot and killed by police in Tulsa, Oklahoma. On April 4th, 2015, Walter Scott, who was unarmed, was shot and killed by police in North Charleston, South Carolina. On April 19th, 2015, Freddie Gray, who was unarmed, died in police custody in Baltimore, Maryland. On July 6, 2016, Samuel Dubose, who was unarmed, was shot and killed by police in Cincinnati, Ohio. The frequency of these killings and the absence of full accountability for those responsible sent a message to members of the African American community that black lives do not matter. Well, let me state clearly for the record that black lives matter. Our criminal justice system, including our police departments, cannot function without African Americans knowing that their lives matter equally, that the system works to protect them just as it does every other citizen. We must also be able to put ourselves in the shoes of our law enforcement officers. We must be able to celebrate the service and sacrifices of our men and women in law enforcement who put their lives on the line day in and day out. We must recognize the psychological toll that serving in such an inherently dangerous job can take on individual law enforcement officers and their families. It is also critical that we not paint law enforcement with a broad brush. The vast majority of officers execute their jobs with dignity, honor, and respect for the citizens they serve and protect. Every American should take pride in that. Research shows that a small percentage of repeat offenders are responsible for the majority of incidents of misconduct. Today's hearing presents a unique opportunity for us to hear from some of the individuals and families affected by police misconduct. So I want to personally thank Ms. Carr for speaking at this hearing on behalf of her son, and Mr. Blake for sharing his personal story with us. Today presents an opportunity for us to explore bipartisan solutions to make policing a safer, more fulfilling job for law enforcement officers by restoring the trust and goodwill between police and the communities they serve. We can re-examine the efficacy of reforms advanced by President Obama's Task Force on 21st Century Policing and determine what further solutions are warranted. For example, we should examine whether the incentives created by the doctrine of qualified immunity remain useful in today's environment. We should consider legislative proposals to end racial profiling and to restore trust between law enforcement and the community. And we should explore ways to strengthen data collection on use of force and racial profiling so that police departments can measure the practices they manage. But most important, we can all agree that too many lives are put at risk and have been lost in police-citizen encounters, and that it is incumbent upon each of us to work together as fellow Americans to solve this problem. I thank all of our witnesses for appearing, and I look forward to their testimony. I now recognize the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. And before I get started, I would like to add to the record a letter from the Detectives Endowment Association, New York, and also the National Association of Police Organizations, a letter for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. I appreciate the chairman's opening, and I think you covered a great deal of stuff. For me, and I have a lot of notes here and listening, I think one of the things that, to start out this, is it is very important that excessive force, where used, ought to be punished. It should not be thought about, it should be punished, and should be put before a proper due process procedure and then acted upon quickly. It shouldn't be drug out. It should not be, if it's in a minority community in particular or any other community, it needs to be looked at, it needs to be processed, and it needs to be done so in a fair way to all involved so that there is justice, there is possibility, so that people do trust. But the one thing that I do want to focus on, and the chairman did a good job, I think, because it is very fair that there's a lot of things that have happened in communities that raise a lot of concerns. But we even, on this committee, have a job to look over and say, how do we fix this? And there's actually officers on this committee, and I serve with, and Ms. Demmings is one of those who have done this, put on that uniform and been out there. I come at it a different position, though, that I do want to emphasize, and I think this is why we have this hearing today. Because I'm going to take it from a perspective that I don't think anybody wants to see justice go unserved. And I think the interesting perspective here is my perspective that there is no one that wants the bad actors out of law enforcement more than law enforcement itself. I'm the son of a Georgia State Trooper. I've made the joke before that I fought the law and the law won every time. Okay, 6'2", 250 pounds in a blue and gray uniform with a 357 on his hip. I was a scrawny kid from Gainesville. Daddy loved us, but he was in Georgia. He understood that. And he, would come home. I'm the little kid that would watch Dad go out to work, and when he would come home at night, and he'd come in with his uniform torn, blood on his collar. And, how does that affect an 8-year-old, 9-year-old kid? That's my daddy. That's the man that, to this day, he's 80 years old. He's a big teddy bear now because of grandchildren. That's a big factor. But this is the man that I admire to this day. I am who I am because of him. And what would happen, my dad was a strong man and is a strong man. And one of the interesting things that I always found is when something would go wrong with an officer, and we had an officer in Georgia who was a Georgia State Trooper who I knew personally, and I'm tempted to call it a mistake. It's not. He committed a crime. He had a sexual encounter with someone in his custody, and he's in jail. It's rape. He was punished for it. But you know what was even more amazing to me was my dad's reaction to that.
My dad came home and didn't, he was upset, he was mad. I could tell it because as the chairman talked about how this plays out in the police force, it played out at home. It played out because my dad come home and didn't talk about it. My dad was mad as he could be about somebody tarnishing the badge in the uniform that he wore. There's no one, I believe, honestly, in this country who wants bad actors who do bad things out of the police force more than the police themselves. And as someone who understands this and watched my father live it every day, when he was painted with that broad brush that the chairman spoke of, that I'm glad we're not going to use, when he was painted because of others, then it affects everybody in a high risk, many times low reward area. Some of the things I would love to see us talk about, the thin blue line denotes a separation from order and chaos. It should always be there. No one in our country should not look at our police force and know this is what keeps us all safe, no matter who we are or what our beliefs or what our color of our skin. It is what keeps us different than the rest of the world. A safe, orderly police force that carries out our laws faithfully and executes them to the best of their ability. But too often, I served on that police working group. And I've been all over the country in Georgia and other places, and we have problems in our police force because there's too many folks who are bad actors who get pushed from one job to another. Let's talk honestly, let's talk honestly. You got bad actors who can't make it at one job. They go to another police force, and it's sort of like, yeah, do you know him? Yeah, okay, yeah, he got another job. The one police chief is saying, thank God. The other police chief is saying, I don't know what I got into. But you know why? Because pay, benefits, the issues of communities. I live in a rural community in North Georgia. My North Georgia kids, who live in some of my smaller counties, they're going to go to work if they can with the sheriff's department, but they're making an amount that they can go 40 miles down the road and double their salary. Or if they can't make it in one of those, they know they can go somewhere else and get another job, no matter sort of what their record is. So as we come to this hearing today, it does need to be a hearing of what I'll call the terrible acts. We need to acknowledge them, and we need to admit that justice needs to be served. But there's nothing about this hearing that all shows the tank that the 98 or 99, whatever percent you want to do, of those men and women who wake up every day with only one responsibility, taking care of their communities and taking care of the lives that they have. And they want nothing more than these bad actors to go away so that they can do their job. And when they lay their head down at night, they know they've done their best. They want to be respected because they have done their job and not because somebody else has acted badly. When that happens, then our law enforcement understands that we respect them, we love them, and we're going to help them where they need help. And for every other 10-year-old kid who watches their dad go out, not knowing if they're going to come home, or when they do come home, they're beat up and battered because they were out helping others. And when they see their dad or their mom upset because their profession, their calling is tarnished by those who would tarnish it, justice must be swift, it must be firm, and it must be fairly applied. Because if not, we lose who we are. We would not be who we are without our police force. We now need to help them make it better. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. I want to note that the gentlelady from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, is here with us, and we thank her for attending. I will now introduce today's witnesses. Gwen Carr is the mother of Eric Garner, who died during the course of his arrest by police officers. As a result of this tragic event, she became a leading advocate for improving policing practices and currently facilitates the This Stops Today program through the nonprofit ERIC, Eliminating Racism and Inequality Collectively. She is here today to share her personal experience. Ron Davis served as director of the U.S. Department of Justice's Community-Oriented Policing Services Office from 2013 to 2017. In December 2014, he was appointed to serve as executive director of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. Prior to serving as COPS director, he was the chief of police of East Palo Alto, California for more than 8 years, and previously served 20 years with the Oakland Police Department. Director Davis received his BA from Southern Illinois University and completed the Senior Executives in State and Local Government program at Harvard University, Kennedy School of Government. Patrick Yose, I hope I pronounced that right. Captain Patrick Yose is the national president of the Fraternal Order of Police. Since 1984, he has served in a variety of roles in the St. Charles Sheriff's Office in St. Charles Parish, Louisiana, and currently is the commander of the Special Services Department. He earned a Bachelor of Science from Mountain State University and an Associate of Science from Nichols State University. He's also a graduate of the FBI National Academy. The Reverend Al Sharpton is the founder and president of the National Action Network, a national civil rights advocacy organization. He attended Brooklyn College and received an honorary doctorate of divinity from Bethune-Cookman University, Virginia Union University, as well as an honorary degree from AP Bible College. James Blake is a former tennis professional and currently is a correspondent and host for the Tennis Channel. He's also the tournament director for the Miami Open, so I suppose we can get good tickets. Mr. Blake is here today to speak about his personal experiences with law enforcement. Gina Hawkins has served more than 30 years in law enforcement and is currently the Chief of Police for the Fayetteville, North Carolina Police Department. She also serves as an executive board member of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. Chief Hawkins received her Bachelor of Science from Georgia State University and a Master of Science from Johns Hopkins University. She is also a graduate of the FBI National Associates Academy. Heather Mcdonald is the Thomas W. Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research. She has written numerous books on the criminal justice system and previously clerked for Judge Stephen Reinhart on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. Ms. Mcdonald received her BA from Yale University, her MA from Clare College, and her JD from Stanford University Law School. Philip Atiba Goff is the co-founder and president of the Center for Policing Equity. He also serves as professor of police equity at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Professor Goff has written extensively on policing issues. He received his AB from Harvard University and his MA and PhD from Stanford University. Finally, Linda Garcia is the Policing Campaign Director at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Before joining the Leadership Conference, Ms. Garcia served as a trial attorney in the Special Litigation Section in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. She also served as a law clerk to Judge John Gleason in the Eastern District of New York. Ms. Clark received her BA from Hunter College and her JD from Fordham Law School, my alma mater. We welcome all of our distinguished witnesses and we thank them for participating in today's hearing. Now, if you would please rise, I will begin by swearing you in. Raise your hand, please. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and beliefs, so help you God? You may be seated. Let the record show the witness has answered in the affirmative. Please note that each of your written statements will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, I ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. To help you stay within that time, there is a timing light on your table. When the light switches from green to yellow, you have 1 minute to conclude your testimony. When the light turns red, it signals your 5 minutes have expired. Ms. Carr, you may begin. Good morning. Turn the mic on and speak closely into it.
Okay. Yes, Chairman Nadler and members of the Judiciary Committee, I thank you for having me this morning. My name is Gwen Carr. I am the mother of Eric Garner. 5 years ago, my beloved son Eric was murdered by people who were supposed to serve and protect. On July 17th, the NYPD police officers approached my son. One of them put him in an illegal chokehold. Eric cried out 11 times, "I can't breathe." 11 times he said, "I can't breathe." But those officers who were on the scene that day, they didn't seem to care. Eric died that day. There was a video that captured the incident, including the chokehold and my son's cry saying that he couldn't breathe. This went viral around the world. So my thought is today, how come no one was held accountable? No one was held and charged for my son's death. But not only the officer that murdered my son, but all the officers who were on the scene need to stand accountable for his death that day. I will never forget that day in July. I got up that morning and I spoke to Eric. I spoke to him for about 10 minutes. And afterwards, we said our goodbyes. He said, "I love you, Mom." I said, "I love you too, Eric." Never knowing that would be our last and final conversation. My entire life was uprooted on that July day. I felt helpless in a dark place, scattered in millions of pieces. It is impossible to describe the pain that I felt that day. Losing a child is just indescribable. Having the burden of finding out exactly what happened to your child by the police who was responsible for his demise. How is a person supposed to get answers? Who does she go to for help? Most people can't even comprehend how difficult it is to suddenly lose a child and to fight for 5 years and just get an ounce of accountability. It has impacted our lives in many devastating ways. Almost 2 months ago, I lost my husband. He was my partner in every sense of the word. He fought the long fight with me, even though he wasn't in front of the cameras. He supported me, and he really supported the cause. My granddaughter, Erica, she died December 17th of a heart attack. She was only 27 years old. But when my son was murdered, she fought the good fight. She fought until she became ill. I say she died of a broken heart. These are the wounds of the seen and unseen from the police brutality, the loss of loved ones, and no recourse, no accountability. The entire family is traumatized. Each and every time we enter the courtroom or watch the officers responsible for my son's death get a pay raise, or hear the Department of Justice saying they're not going to seek charges, or when an officer who is the commanding officer of the person who was on the scene when my son was murdered said it was not a big deal that Eric laid on the ground DOA. I come before you today not only to share my son's story or the long quest of justice that we've been seeking for 5 years, but I urge you to take immediate action to imply the national changes and standards towards policing. In 2015, I stood with Representative Hakeem Jeffries as we introduced the bill that would make chokeholds illegal under federal civil rights law. Once the bill is reintroduced, this season I call for you to support and vote for legislation. The Excessive Use of Force Prevention Act of 2019, please vote for it. Violent police have no place in this society. So, like you said, Mr. Nadler, let's get them out of here. No officer who is not there to do his job should be on the police force. So again, I asked you to please vote on this bill.
Ms. Carr, thank you for your moving testimony. The committee understands how difficult this was for you and has agreed not to subject you to questions out of respect. We now invite you to join us for the remainder of the hearing in the front row, if you so desire. Mr. Davis.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Collins, and distinguished committee members. My name is Ronald Davis, and I had the distinct honor of serving as Director of the United States Department of Justice, Office of Community Order Policing Services in the Obama administration. I also served as the Executive Director of President Obama's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. Before my service in the administration, I spent close to 30 years in local policing, 20 years in the great city of Oakland, California, and 8 years as police chief in the great city of East Palo Alto. My testimony is based on these perspectives, as well as my perspective as a black man and a father of black children. First, as a 20-year police veteran, I know firsthand the complex, challenging, and dangerous nature of being a police officer. As a police chief, I had to tell a wife that her husband, one of my brave police officers, was shot and killed in the line of duty. I've personally seen the toll being a police officer takes on so many. I've lost friends and colleagues to suicide, a threat which is now growing at an exponential rate. But I've also seen a lot of positive changes in policing in areas such as technology, crime reduction, diversity training, and in community policing. However, as a black man, I know that despite these efforts, significant racial disparities still exist in our policing and criminal justice system. I do not believe these disparities exist because the profession is full of racists. I believe they exist because of structural racism. Many of the systems and practices in policing that exist today were designed in the 1950s and 60s to enforce discriminatory laws and to oppress black Americans. We must acknowledge the history of policing in this country and the role that police have played in enforcing discriminatory laws and continue to play through draconian discriminatory policing practices. With that being said, I think it's fair to say that positive changes have started, especially through some of the work of President Obama's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. So as I testify today here, Mr. Chairman, my concern is not that we haven't made progress. My concern is that this Department of Justice is attempting to stop this progress by returning to the failed policies and practices of the 80s and 90s, policies that resulted in unequal justice. I was a street cop in Oakland during the 80s and 90s, and I can tell you firsthand that this nostalgia for the policing practices of those years is dangerously misplaced. I worked in units that made thousands of arrests of mostly young men of color while simultaneously watching the homicide rate climb to record levels. I also witnessed these practices destroy the future of thousands of young men of color with unfair sentencing practices. We now know that these practices caused significant collateral damage and they did not work. What did work in Oakland and so many other communities was community policing and the use of evidence-based programs such as Operation Ceasefire and focused deterrent strategies. Now, there will be those that will argue that the tactics of the 90s did work. And I guess if taking a lot of people to jail and having statistical crime numbers go up and down for a couple of months is success, then it worked. But in our democracy, public safety is not just the absence of crime, it must include the presence of justice. And this idea, taking from Dr. King's quote on peace, must serve as the foundation for how we evaluate all policing practices in our criminal justice system. As most of you know, the American policing system is by design decentralized and controlled locally so that policing practices are accountable to local community values and their priorities. So it is especially disheartening to hear the Attorney General of the United States attack local mayors and prosecutors for their efforts to respond to their local community. It is also disheartening to hear people, including those in this administration, talk about how they support the men and women of law enforcement, yet their actions do not back this rhetoric. Don't tell me you support law enforcement and local control of police, and then threaten to take away grant funding if local police refuse to enforce federal immigration laws. Don't talk about cops having the resources necessary to do their job, and then vote against funding for the cops office to hire and train more cops. And do not demand community respect for law enforcement while advocating for those very policies that you know will destroy that trust. I remind you that in New York, it was first the officers and their union that was against stop, question, and frisk, but it was implemented nonetheless. And when it went bad, the officers were blamed. Now that the Justice Department is advocating for a return to those same types of policies, they're ignoring the lessons of the past while ignoring the voices from the field, once again, placing officers and the community in untenable positions. This is why this hearing is so important. Through its grants programs, technical assistance, and civil rights enforcement, the Justice Department can play a role to help out the 16,000 to 18,000 police agencies in the United States to make sure that whether the department has 4 cops or 40,000 cops, that they have access to the best policies and training and practices in the country. There is much the federal government can help police, and since my time is winding down, let's give you a couple of the recommendations. The first recommendation is that we rescind the Sessions memo and restore the ability for the Civil Rights Department to conduct pattern and practice investigations. That we work collaboratively with local law enforcement and communities to develop and implement new and innovative strategies to enhance public safety. That we restore funding to train officers and deputies in implicit bias and procedural justice. That we increase funding to the National Institute of Justice to expand its capacity to conduct research and evaluate crime strategies. That we work with local prosecutors instead of criticizing them to reform the criminal justice system. That we expand the efforts to develop strategies to enhance officer safety and wellness, and that we support the End Racial Profiling Act to make sure that that accountability is in every department in this country. As a black man and as a former cop, I should be able to drive anywhere in this country and expect the same constitutional treatment, and it should not be depending on how big the department is or how much money that they have. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Yos.
Good morning. Chairman Nadler, Ranking Member Collins, and distinguished members of the committee. I thank you for the opportunity to appear here today and speak on behalf of the nearly 350,000 members of the Fraternal Order of Police. My name is Patrick Yos, and just over a month ago, I was elected president of the National Fraternal Order of Police. We are the nation's oldest and largest law enforcement organization. My full testimony has been submitted for the record, and with the chairman's permission, I'd like to summarize at this point. My profession is evolving. Some of these changes are driven by technology, others by society, and of course by our own internal efforts to improve public safety and the services we provide to the communities. As a law enforcement officer, I've spent 35 years of my career answering calls for help, and I'm here today to let you know that the Fraternal Order of Police is ready to sit with anyone who genuinely wants to work collectively to help improve policing in this country. Today, we're calling on you for your help. Law enforcement officers were once universally respected. Parents would tell their children, if you need help, find a police officer. This may no longer be true. Recent events indicate that a growing percentage of the general public view officers with suspicion and disdain. In far too many cases, it's escalated into physical hostility. We are public servants. We're not public enemies. We live and raise our families in these same communities, and we're vested in the success of these communities. Our jobs are becoming increasingly dangerous. Ambush attacks on law enforcement officers have been increasing over the last 8 years, and a recent study by the FBI concluded that many of these cases were motivated by the desire to hurt or kill a police officer. Congress needs to act to reduce this type of targeted violence by once again passing H.R. 1325, the Protect and Serve Act, introduced by Representatives Rutherford and Demings. Chief, thank you. Thank you for your steadfast support for law enforcement. This will not make every attack on an officer a federal crime. What it will do is give the U.S. Department of Justice a tool in certain limited circumstances to fight back against targeted attacks like those that occurred in Dallas, Texas, and Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in my home state. Last year, this committee passed this legislation unanimously, and the House passed it overwhelmingly at a vote of 382 to 35. Passing this legislation again would demonstrate that this House supports the men and women in law enforcement, because right now we're feeling abandoned. These changes in attitudes are having an impact on our ability of our profession to retain and recruit the very best and brightest. Applications for positions in law enforcement have decreased this year by as much as 66%, leaving too many agencies short-shifted and overworked. My organization is also working to improve. We have engaged many of the organizations here today, represented here today, on issues of body cameras and improving law enforcement transparency while still protecting privacy rights. We have participated in each and every public meeting of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, and we have supported the majority of that body's findings, and we have worked with this committee to implement many of them. We have engaged with the administration and many of the groups represented here today to support the historic First Step Act. While many of our fellow law enforcement organizations chose to withhold their support, the FOP was able to support it because we were engaged in the conversation and were able to and committed to improving not just our profession, but the criminal justice system as a whole. I think everyone could be proud of the results because we achieved it by working together. Another issue of which there is bipartisan support is addressing the issue of mental health and wellness amongst the men and women in law enforcement. Being a police officer is not an easy job. It has evolved into including the role of therapist, marriage counselor, addiction specialist, and spiritual advisor. Some statistics suggest that a police officer will experience more traumatic events in a 6-month period than an average person will experience in a lifetime. It can take a tremendous toll on a person's physical and mental well-being. First responders have 5 times more PTSD depression than a civilian. Yet there's little has been done to address this, and a number of police suicides seem to be grossly underreported. In 2017, there were 140 officers took their own lives. In contrast, in that year, 46 officers were fatally shot and killed in the line of duty. Police officers run towards danger, while most run away. Rather than cast them aside, we have a moral and a fiduciary responsibility to fix that which has been broken in the service of our communities. The passage of legislation like the Law Enforcement Mental Health and Wellness Act and the Supporting and Treating of Officers in Crisis Act, also known as STOIC, will certainly help us grapple with this issue. Finally, my profession must continue to work hard to build trust and respect for the communities we protect. There must be an open dialogue and a willingness to build consensus. We cannot do it alone, and I promise you the Fraternal Order of Police will do its part. I thank you again for the opportunity to speak here today, and I'll be available for questions.
Thank you. Reverend Sharpton.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler and Ranking Member Collins. As president of National Action Network, I've submitted my testimony. I would like to summarize it by saying that what we really seek is this committee to begin moving toward federal law and federal standards that would define clearly where the line is in terms of excessive force and take this argument from a state and local level to where there's a federal standards that all must abide by. What we have seen in the last several years is that in different cities where we are called in every case we have fought, including the Eric Garner case and the cases that we've submitted this morning, Mother Michael Brown has submitted a testimony from Ferguson, Missouri. The mother of Stephon Clark has submitted testimony. We have seen different counties react different ways. It reminds me of my studying the early stages of the 1960s of the movement for civil rights. Until the federal government stepped in, they would have to fight state by state, county by county against segregation. So it was the judgment of Martin Luther King Jr. and others to appeal for federal government intervention rather than fight in Alabama, then have to fight in Georgia, et cetera, et cetera. Unless the federal government steps in and deals with federal standards and federal laws, we will be subjected to the local politics and at the whims of local back and forward that could differ in another state. We need to have federal law that sets various unimpugned standards that will be followed. What do I mean by that? Federal government determined in several states, several counties, several cities, that they were going to place certain police departments in where the Justice Department would be over and supervise them because there was a pattern and practice that demonstrated excessive force. When this present administration came in, they immediately suspended that in several of those cities. They had not been in long enough to make an investigation. So what was the determination that made them decide that they would stop what had been determined by the Justice Department before them after an investigation? This committee needs to investigate why incoming Attorney General Sessions, upheld now by Barr, withheld and removed this designation, because it really sends the signal that we will allow patterns and practice to continue, even though a Justice Department, not National Action Network, not activists, not Black Lives Matter, the Justice Department said there was a pattern. I think that we also must have certain standards in terms of when we talk about body cameras, that they must be regulated where they can't cut the body camera off. We must define, when we look at a Gwen Carr, 5 years waiting on a decision from the federal government on whether charges would be brought, and we read public notices that the Civil Rights Division wanted to charge, but the locals didn't want to charge. For families to have to go through this, it shows again how nebulous and undefined the federal laws are. Just as civil rights activists had to appeal to the federal government 50 years ago to intervene and save us from states' rights mentality, we need to rise above states' rights mentality in law enforcement and set federal law. I'm heartened to hear the head of FOP said that they're willing to be at the table and in these discussions to see where there can be consensus, because we do need consensus. Let me repeat, when police are killed, we are standing firmly against that. Ms. Carr and I led a march when 2 policemen were killed in New York. Another was killed. The family had invited me to see them. Some of the unions got angry. We gave $5,000 for a fund with that. We're not anti-police. We're anti-police brutality. But even when we stand up when police are killed, we're yet to see police unions stand up one time when one of their officers killed someone in the community unjustifiably. I'm not saying every policeman is wrong. The majority of them go out with many reasons to wonder whether they will come home, and they protect all of us. But those that step outside the law must be punished, and the federal government must make that happen. This is not about anti-police. This is about upholding the law, and no one should want bad cops punished more than good cops whose names are smeared because people get to choke people on tape, hearing 11 times "I can't breathe," and you've got to go through 5 years of torment and finally be turned down and got to beg, pray, and march to just take his job. This is not what America should be about. The president and others can excuse it. I think it's on the Congress to act. President says, "I hate cops." No, I just dislike the president. I don't hate cops. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Nadler and members of the Judiciary Committee, thank you all for this opportunity to speak here. In 2015, I was standing and waiting for a car on 42nd Street in Manhattan outside of the Grand Hyatt Hotel when, I believe we have the video, this happened. This was an extremely vulnerable and infuriating situation when I knew I had done nothing wrong, and this was entirely an abuse of power and intimidation. Luckily for me, I made it out alive. What happened to me was unfortunate, but it could have easily been tragic with only minor changes. I was aware of that as a possibility, as the news prior to this had been peppered with cases from Alton Sterling, Terrence Crutcher, Laquan McDonald, Tamir Rice, and the list goes on and on. Those are tragedies that didn't need to happen. When I realized how common these occurrences were, and still are, it forced me into action. I had to speak up to give a voice to those that didn't have that option. It was amazing to me as I was in New York after this incident occurred, how many people came up to me with similar stories, worse stories, or repeated instances. They didn't have the benefit of being able to raise awareness or talk about the case on Good Morning America the next day, or meet with the mayor and police chief personally. I got those benefits because of my previous career as an athlete, and I'm fully aware that the video showing the attack clear as day made all the difference. Before anyone was aware of the video, the police department was already in damage control and stated that they were investigating whether force was used and that I was only in cuffs for less than a minute. Had there been no video, it would have been my word against the police. I think we all know how that goes, no matter how credible the victim is. But because there was a video, and it entirely backed my account of the incident, there was a public apology and meeting with the mayor and police chief. That gave me more responsibility to find a way to hold the city accountable. Not all are able to have the benefit of video evidence when these abuses happen. And even with video evidence, too often families of the deceased are undermined and not believed, as we've tragically seen with clear-cut cases, including Eric Garner and Delron Small, where police have raised questions and alternate theories in spite of what our own eyes see on the tape. Accountability is an issue that strikes a nerve with me for this case. The state that this country is in right now is in a crisis with regard to the lack of police accountability. I'm confident there'll be plenty of statistics and data to support the lack of accountability many police officers face, but I feel compelled just to give my personal experience. I was attacked in broad daylight without even raising a hand or making any move to run. This was done by an officer who already had numerous complaints and even settlements for excessive force. This information was leaked to the press when, in my opinion, there should be a national database that is public information for all officer abuse and brutality cases. So this led me to believe that the solution should be his termination from the NYPD. Instead, the hearings for discipline were dragged out over nearly 2 years, and he lost 5 vacation days, 1 week of work, which I would have lost far more had I still been on tour at this time from the injury sustained. All the while, he was still collecting his paychecks from the city of New York. This gets at one of the serious problems I've seen. All the consequences are based on past precedent. Past precedent has been set from the times when the police were policing themselves, so the punishments were far too lenient. When I asked the Civilian Complaint Review Board to suggest firing, they clearly let me know that they could not and would not do that. My status, they feared, would hinder any hope of getting that, as it would look like preferential treatment for a celebrity. I didn't want preferential treatment. I wanted justice and what was best for the city. I couldn't think of a more appropriate case to set a new precedent with. If this is what is supposed to be a deterrent, I cannot imagine this would slow down anyone with the attitude of abusing power and authority. Worse still, it may embolden someone to do much worse and feel like they can again get away with this behavior. To me, this leaves blood on the hands of those in power that can do something to stop these abuses before they escalate. I'm just one example of the harm suffered by countless people at the hands of police in this country. There are numerous stories that remain untold. Until we know these stories, it will be difficult to obtain police reform. The Congress must require that states collect data on all police community encounters. It must ensure that the death and custody reporting law, which requires an accounting of deaths in police custody, is enforced by the Department of Justice. The Congress must also advance legislation like the End Racial Profiling Act, sponsored by Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, and the Pride Act, sponsored by Congressman Joaquin Castro. These bills require reporting on law enforcement stops, searches, use of force, and other interactions. I think about my encounter with the NYPD, and I think how lucky I was that I had no fight or flight response. I think about those who weren't so lucky. Eric Garner was put in a chokehold by an officer. That chokehold had been banned decades earlier, but was still used and led to his death. The Congress must take up the Excessive Use of Force Prevention Act, sponsored by Hakeem Jeffries, which designates the chokehold as excessive and prohibited use of force of law enforcement. These acts can't change what happened to me. They can't bring back Walter Scott or Marley Graham, but they can hopefully make a difference in thwarting those types of situations before they happen, and adding a level of accountability if they do happen. Thank you all for allowing me to use my voice here to bring attention to some possible solutions to save future lives and improve community and police relations.
Thank you very much. Chief Hawkins.
Committee Chairman Nadler, Ranking Member Collins, and members of the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on the Judiciary. I bring you greetings on behalf of the Executive Board and members of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, NOBLE. My name is Gina Hawkins, and I am the National Treasurer of NOBLE and the Chief of Police for the Fayetteville Police Department in Fayetteville, North Carolina. It is an honor to be here for NOBLE to provide written testimony on the topic of policing oversight. NOBLE has been at the forefront of promoting police accountability since the organization's inception in 1976. Our mission is to ensure equity in the administration of justice and the provisions of public service to all communities, and to serve as the conscience of law enforcement by being committed to justice by action. Law enforcement agencies and their leaders have a responsibility to ensure that justice is administered fairly in all communities. NOBLE member chiefs and sheriffs hold ourselves and our agencies to a high professional standards, ensuring that officers and communities we serve and protect are aligned with a priority for everyone's safety. Police are not perfect, and we recognize the need to take steps to improve service, build trust in our communities, and increase operational transparency. Noble has been actively involved in national level discussions on the key areas of police accountability, use of force, and reducing gun violence. There has been universal recognition expressed by Noble to the United States Department of Justice on the importance of maintaining a level of police accountability in the form of the previous model of the collaborative reform initiatives or similar style federal resources. Law enforcement agencies that seek to improve their operations use the nationally adopted blueprint for 21st century policing and build trust and legitimacy with their communities should be afforded the technical assistance resources available for improvement without any punitive federal level recourse. Agency leaders should also have access to high quality policing professionals who can assist that agency with assessing areas for improvement and developing strategies to modernize their police operations and culture to best meet the needs of the 21st century policing as already outlined by the Department of Justice. As chief of the Fayetteville Police Department, my predecessor used the technical assistance resources provided through the collaborative reform to help the agency develop a strategy to improve engagement at all levels of the department, and particularly with communities of color. Our department did not shy away from taking a close look at our training, traffic and pedestrian stop data, and our citizen engagement to identify areas of improvement. Today, we are a better informed and engaged department because of the leadership that I and other Noble leaders provide to their agency, because we recognize the need to measure up to the expectations of our communities and ensure policing is a credible profession respected in our communities for being honest, trustworthy, fair to everyone we serve and protect. The federal government can play an important role in influencing local municipalities and their police agencies to address systemic issues that are adversely impacting their ability to protect and serve their communities. A key assumption that has been challenged by Noble is that policing organizations can easily police themselves without the best practices and following the nationally adopted blueprint for 21st century policing. As the data shows, it is very rare for the federal government to enforce a consent decree. Since 1997, there have only been 21 court-enforced consent decrees on law enforcement agencies compared to the over 18,000 agencies that serve our communities. Most law enforcement agencies are filled with committed, fair, and honest men and women who put our police uniforms on every day with the sole intent of keeping everyone safe. In the instance where deadly force is used, a third-party intervention could be beneficial, and many states and even agencies have adopted policies that already implement this critical plus public trust component. The ultimate goal in police accountability is to strengthen trust and legitimacy between law enforcement and the community. A strong, trustworthy, legitimate agency can create a safer environment for law enforcement officers and the citizens of that community. Noble police chiefs and sheriffs provide law enforcement agency leadership to over half of the largest cities in the nation. We are committed to effective community policing and holding our agencies and officers to the highest standards in the policing profession. On behalf of the law enforcement leaders of Noble, thank you for supporting law enforcement and our ability to maintain public safety while continuing to build strong relationships with our communities. Our members stand ready to meet the needs of our diverse communities. Thank you again for this opportunity to provide testimony.
Thank you. Ms. Mcdonald.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler, Ranking Member Collins, and committee members for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Heather Mcdonald. I'm a fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research. Since the 1990s, felony crime in the United States has dropped 50%. Tens of thousands of lives, the majority Black and Hispanic, have been saved, closing the life expectancy gap between whites and Blacks by 17%. This crime drop was the result of a policing revolution that began in New York City in 1994 and spread nationwide. Upon taking office, New York Police Commissioner William Bratton dared something that few police chiefs had ever risked. He publicly set himself a target for crime reduction. Bratton not only met his one-year goal of 10%, he beat it with a crime decline of 12%. The next year, he upped the ante, declaring that the New York Police Department would lower crime by 15%. That year's crime drop locked in at 16%. The idea that the police would take measurable responsibility for public safety was transformative. Bratton accomplished his crime rout with three main strategies: timely information, accountability, and proactive policing. Deputy commissioners started demanding crime information in real time so that crime patterns could be addressed as they first broke out. Top brass held precinct commanders ruthlessly accountable for crime in their jurisdictions, and officers on the beat were asked to intervene proactively when they observed suspicious behavior. Broken windows policing was a crucial aspect of this policing revolution. It addresses low-level social disorders such as loitering, unruly conduct, and public drinking and drug use. Broken windows policing is not just a crime strategy, however, it is a moral imperative. It is the hard-working, law-abiding residents of high-crime neighborhoods who beseech the police to address street disorder. Go to any police community meeting in a high-risk community, and you will hear the good people there beg the police to get the drug dealers off the streets, to clear the corners of rowdy youth, and to crack down on loud music and illegal street parties. The residents know that it is out of such unchecked social disorder that more serious crime emerges. A 2015 Quinnipiac poll found that 61% of black voters in New York City wanted the police to issue summonses or make arrests in their neighborhood for quality of life offenses, compared to 59% of white voters. Should the police ignore their voices because the activists say that broken windows policing is racist? We are also told that we are living through an epidemic of racially biased police shootings of black men. This, too, is false. A study published this August in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences is just the latest research undercutting the media narrative about race and police shootings. It is the rate of violent crime that determines police shootings, the study found. The more frequently officers encounter violent suspects from any given racial group, the greater the chance that members of that group will be shot by a police officer. In fact, black civilians are shot less compared to whites than their rates of violent crime would predict, the study found. If there is a bias in police shootings, it is against white civilians. The anti-police narrative deflects attention away from solving the real criminal justice problem, which is high rates of black victimization. Blacks die of homicide at 8 times the rate of whites. The homicide death rate for black males between the ages of 15 and 24 is 16 times higher than that of young white men. That is the civil rights problem that should most concern us. Those black victims are killed not by cops, not by whites, but by other blacks. Blacks commit homicide nationally at 8 times the rate of whites and Hispanics combined. In 2017, there were nearly 8,000 black homicide victims, more than all white and homicide victims combined. Only 2.8% of those black casualties, the vast majority armed with a gun or otherwise dangerous, were killed by a cop. The best solution to urban crime is to reconstruct the family. That is a long-term project, however. In the meantime, the policing revolution that began in New York in the 1990s and spread nationwide has given law-abiding residents of high-crime communities greater freedom to take their children to school or to go to the grocery store without fear, an expectation that is the government's most fundamental obligation to meet. Policing today is more professional and restrained than at any time in its history, and there is no government agency more dedicated to the proposition that Black lives matter than the police. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Dr. Goff?
Thank you, Chairman Nadler, distinguished members of the Judiciary Committee. My name is Phil Batiba Goff. I am a professional nerd. I am also, by disposition, a relatively conflict-averse person. But my love of country and my respect for this body, and mostly my vocation as a scientist, will not allow me to move to my prepared remarks just yet. I feel I must at least correct the record on some statistical elements. The fall of crime over the course of the last quarter century is just abjectly not in response to police behavior alone. If the members would like further reading on this, I can highly recommend Pat Sharkey's book, Uneasy Peace, which identifies quite clearly that community-based anti-violence work is a large and underappreciated component of reductions in crime, not just police behavior. I should say that I believe that a 2015 Quinnipiac poll was just cited as evidence, perhaps implying that black people actually liked broken windows policing. If memory serves, that exact same Quinnipiac poll showed that black people were concerned about racial bias within law enforcement, a trend that has escalated over the period of time since 2015. To suggest that black people enjoyed the treatment in New York or any place else of broken windows policing is what scholars Veshla Weaver and Elizabeth Hinton refer to as selective hearing. Hearing only what is convenient to an ideological narrative and not the fullness of what those communities are calling for, which is safety and justice at the same time. Surely not too high a bar for law enforcement. And last, in terms of clarification, a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences was just cited, and I have to say, first of all, no, that is not what it said. Most importantly, the authors of that study have recently acknowledged to the rest of the scientific community, or I should say to some members of the scientific community, that their central causal claim is unsupported by the data and factually wrong. This committee hearing should not be a dumping ground for bad faith arguments.
Dr. Goff, we've heard a lot of witnesses, and you're testifying now about a central causal claim. Could you just tell us what which causal claim you're refuting? I mean, what you're talking about?
The study just cited by Ms. Mcdonald in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences does not show that white officers are less or more likely to be involved in deadly shootings. It simply does not. It's a correlational study, and the authors themselves have admitted to others in the scientific community that the central causal claim that they make, which is that there is no bias in this, is unsupported by the data that have been made public and have been publicly analyzed by scholars like Jonathan Mumolo at Princeton University. I do not like to be part of anything where that becomes a laundromat for junk science, and so I apologize for stepping out of my character to say so. And I would like to thank you for the privilege of being invited to testify. May I return to my prepared remarks? In my day job, I am a professor. As I said, I'm a nerd at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, a position I accepted after receiving tenure at UCLA in the Psych Department. I was a witness for the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, a member of the National Academies of Sciences Committee that issued a consensus report on proactive policing, and was one of 3 leads on the recently concluded Department of Justice National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice. But I am likely best known for my work with the Center for Policing Equity. For the past decade, I have had the pleasure of being the president of the Center for Policing Equity, CPE, which is the largest research and action organization focused on equity in policing. And my testimony today is in that capacity. CPE is host to what is, to our knowledge, the largest collection of police behavioral data, the National Justice Database, funded by the the U.S. National Science Foundation. Today, I've been asked to talk about what science has to say about public safety. So what does it have to say? Well, first, as with all science, it is important that we define the problem correctly. If we speak only about the role that law enforcement has in keeping communities safe, our conversations will never elevate above blaming people or communities for crime rates, public mistrust, or violence. Framing should be public safety, not just law enforcement. And I cannot echo the comments of Mr. Yost strongly enough. If we're talking about public safety, both communities and law enforcement understand the officers that patrol these neighborhoods need to be of sound mind. They need to have the resources to make sure that mental health and officer wellness are central. Now, having defined the problem as public safety, what are some of the solutions? My colleagues at CPE and at the Yale Justice Collaboratory recently articulated 5 policies rooted in science and practice, called for by the large majority of our law enforcement partners, that we believe have the best chance to produce the biggest returns in law enforcement reform. They are, from the front to the back end of accountability, a national model policy for use of force, similar to the one recently articulated by the Camden Police Department, Previous research demonstrates this can reduce harm, both by communities and officers without elevating risk. I see I am out of time because of my impromptu remarks at the beginning. Those 5 policies are all also introduced into the record, and I would encourage the members to look at it. One last word. Within this, we've heard a lot of talk about data. I think it's important that we move the conversation from data to analysis. In my recently released TED Talk this past September 9th, we talked about an initiative called CompStat for Justice. Because it's possible to measure crime, and Ms. Mcdonald was quite right, that CompStat was a revolution in policing and helped to reduce crime across the country. But you can measure not just racial disparities, but the portion of those disparities for which law enforcement is responsible. Importantly, this initiative at CPE and similar initiatives elsewhere is at the request of law enforcement. They want to know, and they want to lead on that. And I would be remiss if I got out of here without saying that with leaving you with the impression there wasn't already legislation that has been introduced that moves us forward. Obviously, the End Racial Profiling Act sets up the infrastructure for that. I apologize for going over my time. I thank you for the invitation, and I absolutely look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Ms. Garcia.
Chairman Nadler, Ranking Member Collins, and members of the committee. My name is Linda Garcia. I am the director of the policing campaign at the Leadership Conference Education Fund and the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and thank you, Chairman Nadler, for your leadership in calling this hearing to discuss policing best practices. Safety is a civil and human right, without which society cannot thrive and democracy cannot function. Yet in recent years, tragic incidents of police violence have deepened distrust in law enforcement and made people feel less safe, especially within communities of color. It's time to rethink antiquated approaches to public safety that rely on criminalization and which disproportionately affect Black and brown people and fail to address public health issues. When police practices harm communities, it sows mistrust and hinders community engagement, both of which are critical for realizing public safety. The federal government has a role, and indeed a responsibility, to promote the values of fairness, equity, procedural justice, transparency, and accountability within law enforcement agencies. However, the current administration has severely curtailed the Department of Justice's use of consent decrees to address police civil rights abuses. It has also abandoned collaborative reform efforts of the Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services, under which police departments voluntarily sought audits and recommendations to improve trust between the public and police. This does a disservice both to the communities suffering from systemic misconduct and police officers who are left without the tools to police safely. High-profile police shootings of unarmed Black men and other incidents of police misconduct, coupled with the heavy enforcement of low-level offenses, have eroded trust in law enforcement in many communities, including those that are discriminated against on the basis of race, ethnicity, national origin, religion, gender identity, sexual orientation, age, disability, proficiency with the English language, immigration status, and housing status. Where people perceive the criminal legal system to be arbitrary, biased, and unfair, they are less likely to cooperate with police, making us all less safe. In March of 2019, the Education Fund launched the New Era of Public Safety Initiative and report to help build trust between communities and police departments, restore confidence, and reimagine a new paradigm of public safety. While much of the reform must happen at the state and local levels, success will require the leadership, support, and commitment of the federal government, including you, members of Congress. Every year, Congress provides millions of dollars to law enforcement agencies through federal grant programs to support police. This creates a duty for Congress to conduct oversight to ensure that funds are not supporting police practices that harm public safety and erode community trust. Additionally, this responsibility empowers Congress to incentivize police departments to adopt 21st century best practices in community policing. To promote transparency, accountability, and public safety, the Leadership Conference offers the following recommendations to the committee. Reduce the use of excessive force by passing the Police Exercising Absolute Care with Everyone Act of 2019. prohibit discriminatory policing by passing the End Racial and Religious Profiling Act, mandate robust data collection, end the militarization of law enforcement agencies by passing the Stop Militarizing Law Enforcement Act, promote officer health and well-being by redirecting grant monies towards officer support programs and services, invest in non-police responses to crises by expanding community-based mental health and substance use services, and strengthen accountability systems and hold officers accountable for constitutional violations or criminal conduct. Congress has the power to bring about transformative policing that benefits communities and officers. You can provide the support and funding to jurisdictions to implement 21st century policies and practices that are fair, safe, and effective. To realize this vision of public safety, communities and police departments must rebuild trust. This new era of public safety will require community-driven solutions and investment in community services, including education, housing, employment, and healthcare. Our coalition is committed to ensuring policing practices that respect the dignity and humanity of all people. We look forward to working with you until the day these reforms are signed into law. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Since one of our witnesses specifically commented on the testimony of another of our witnesses, we've been asked by the minority if she can comment, and I will grant 1.5 minutes to Ms. Mcdonald for that purpose.
I think it is ironic to call a study in the proceedings in the National Academy of Sciences junk science. The fact that it's correlational means it is not a regression analysis. Nevertheless, the findings remain accurate, that they found no bias in police shootings. This is a finding that has been supported by numerous other studies. In a paper from 2017, Harvard economist Roland Fryer found no evidence of racial discrimination in shootings. The most sophisticated lab study of police don't shoot decisions to date from the University of Washington found that officers were 3 times less likely to shoot unarmed black suspects than unarmed white suspects, and took significantly longer to decide to shoot unarmed black suspects than armed white suspects. Other don't shoot studies by the University of Chicago's Josh Carell have also found no police bias against black civilians. I submit that the belief that we are living through an epidemic of racially biased police shootings is a creation of selective reporting. In 2015, the same year from which the Academy of National Sciences report data came from, the white victims of fatal police shootings included a 50-year-old suspect in a domestic assault in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, who ran at the officer with a spoon, a 28-year-old driver in Des Moines, Iowa, who exited his car and walked quickly towards an officer after a car chase, and a 21-year-old suspect in a grocery store robbery in Akron, Ohio, who had escaped on a bike and who did not remove his hand from his waistband when uttered to do so. Had any of these victims been black, the media and activists would have jumped on their
Regular order,
stories.
Mr. Chairman.
Finish the sentence. Your time is expiring.
Thank you. And added their names to the roster of victims of police racism. Instead, because they are white, they are unknown. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. I thank the I thank the witnesses for their testimony. And we will now proceed under the 5-minute rule. I will begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Dr. Goff, my first question is, Dr. Goff, would you comment on what we've heard, on the evidence, et cetera?
I think I can say under my time, none of that is true. If you'd like me to elaborate, I can.
Do.
The citing of the Roland Fryer study is a study that he has confessed to being embarrassed about. It's been roundly debunked. To say that, I should also clarify that I believe the study you're talking about in terms of the shoot, don't shoot, Ms. Mcdonald, is not from the University of Washington, but from Washington State. I believe you're talking about Lois James. And everybody who studies that research commented on the fact that there was actually no time pressure in the simulation. So with infinite amount of time, when you know you're being studied for a racial bias, it turns out you can correct for it. When you're under time pressure, you have a harder time. That's why it didn't replicate the literally thousands of other research. To say that Josh Carell's research revealed no racial bias is simply inaccurate. It absolutely did. There's 2 forms of racial bias that you can see in these studies. One is in the error rate, and the other is in terms of the length of time it takes. Black suspects were shot more quickly, white armed suspects were shot more slowly, and it was only the case that there was a zero error rate for officers who had been well trained and were not in specialty units like the gang and SWAT unit. Newer officers had a rate of error that was as high, if not higher, than regular civilians. But all of this is beside the point. The idea that there isn't bias it's just not a serious position when you look at the corpus of the science, right? Where there's bias, why there's bias, and what the definition of bias is, that's a worthy discussion. We have defined the problems of racism in terms of defective hearts and minds, and when you're looking in just the hearts and minds of officers, you often do not see it. I am not saying that because there are disparities out there on the street that officers hold in their heart defective character. In fact, it is frequently not that, but situations that produce disparate outcomes. So we need to have a way and then keep officers out of it. The incident of Tamir Rice was noted by the chairman earlier. The officers were very close to an individual who might have had a weapon, but that is, in the words of my chiefs that I deal with, often a situation that can be avoided, right? The way that you avoid that is you don't put your car up next to someone you think is armed. You maintain a safe distance. Now, the officers don't need to be bigoted in their hearts to have engaged in something that was detrimental and a pattern of detrimental findings towards black communities. So if we define that narrowly as the only problem, again, we can't elevate to solving it. So to the question of the science, none of that was right. To the question of how do we move forward, we should define the problem more precisely so that we're not debating whether or not officers are good or bad people. That's not scientifically nor useful from a policy perspective.
Thank you very much. Reverend Sharpton, you have had experience representing multiple victims of police misconduct. Can you describe your experience navigating the process for filing and pursuing misconduct complaints?
I think that the process begins, first of all, National Action Network never gets involved unless we are asked, as I said earlier. The first part is to try and pursue with the local authorities to convene a grand jury and to deal with the possible criminality of the act and to support the family. National Action Network at the same time will provide, as Ms. Carr and others will tell you, whatever resources we can and whatever help we can because they have been traumatized. And even when there are settlements, some of them large, we don't even ask for reimbursement. There's nothing in this for us. I think that the premise of fighting, though, is one against those that may discriminate, but also against excessive force if it is not a person of color. As I listened to the exchange between the nerds on the panel, we are willing to fight for whites that are victims of excessive force. There was an Orthodox Jewish young man killed by police in New York named Gideon Bush. We went out and supported him. I'm here for white people and black people and any other people that are victims of excessive force. When we talk about consent decrees, when we talk about body cameras, when we talk about the things that we've said today, Mr. Chairman, we're not talking about for blacks only. Police ought not violate anybody's civil rights. And I think that that is what's important.
Thank you. Chief Davis, before my time expires, in your testimony, you recommend that the Sessions memo be rescinded. Could you describe the Sessions memo and describe its effects on policing practices and why it should be rescinded?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Shortly after taking office as the Attorney General Sessions put out a memo that curtailed the activities of the Civil Rights Division in conducting pattern and practice investigations. That memo also stopped the volunteer organizational assessments that Chief Hawkins talked about in Fayetteville. The impact of not having pattern practice investigations, not having organizational assessment, means that departments cannot learn what's happening in their own organizations. There's no transparency. You can't do an internal review or an assessment. And in many cases, the agencies ask for this review. In fact, Mr. Chairman, not only was that memo signed that curtailed that activity, there were at least 4 or 5 reports that were completed as I ended my administration with the President Obama that they failed to release, with communities begging for the release. North Charleston with Walter Scott, Fayetteville with Chief Hawkins, a few other places, Milwaukee. And so this idea that what we heard from the Department of Justice, that we will not author any report that is critical of law enforcement, is quite frankly a disservice to law enforcement. When you talk to chiefs around the country, they want to know what's inside the organization, what's working, what's not working, and to do so. And then my last point I'll make about the consent decrees. People think about the consent decrees, in my opinion, as somehow a detriment to policing or an attack on the officers. Consent decrees are usually signed with the city, not the police department, because in many cases, it's dysfunctional city government that also needs oversight to make sure officers have the training, have the equipment, are held accountable, that there's strong disciplinary process. It's not just about the police, it's about doing so. And those 20 or 27 consent decrees, when I was in the Justice Department, have served as the foundation for thousands of agencies to voluntarily make the changes and implement the best practices. As you mentioned, as was mentioned, 16,000 agencies in the United States, Mr. Chairman, and the average is smaller than 100 officers. They do not have the capacity to do research and development to identify best practices and to understand what's happening in the industry. This profession must become a profession, and we need to have national coherence, national best practices, and a kind of accountability that comes with consent decrees.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The last conversation, I want to pick up some. There's a lot of ways we can go with this question, but I'm one, especially serving on this committee, having the background that I do, and I think what you just said was vitally important. Community policing is actions that actually work, and I think they just need to be. In fact, we had to put money back in this year because it was getting stripped out. We actually put that money back in the accounting process, so we believe it works. We believe it works on a lot of levels, and I think this is the part. I consider, crazily enough, a nerd on the panel up here, Mr. Sharpton, is because I believe facts matter, and I believe that we can deal in emotion all day long. But let's hit some things. And Chief, I want to talk. You're in Fayetteville, North Carolina, a military community. It's an interesting place that is a very nice place. And I've been there from the Air Force perspective. Pope, of course, there. But the one thing that I'm seeing a lot of is, and we hear this from our smaller forces, and you represent in the national organization. How do we come to grips without a national, here's how you do it, and again, leaving it to states, places, how do we come up with a system where we're better reporting, as I said in my opening statement, the bad actors? Because I'm sure that you, as chief, want the bad ones out now. Put them in jail. They get them. How do we do that to give the smaller forces, the 4-man forces, the 5-man forces, and again, the big ones always get done. New York City, always, we talk about it, but there's an underlying current here that we don't talk about because, frankly, they don't have the news coverage. How can we do this through the national organizations, through others, to help police chiefs, police commissioners, others, and just sheriffs get a better quality there? And it can't be just all money, because we are all dealing with budgets. You got to deal in the budget. But how do we do that? I'd love to hear your comments on that.
Thank you. So, as I mentioned in the testimony, all agencies and all departments need to have the ability to ask for assistance in examples like the collaborative reform or any other type of method, to be able to ask that question or to be able to ask another professional who has figured out some things and provide those resources. That's noble stance in regards to how we can go make those requests to do best practices. A smaller agency may not have the resources, but they may have the ability to make a phone call to a national organization, say, can you send someone that's near your area? Anyone can call me and my agency, and we do it all the time. We share information consistently. What did you do? What else are you doing? We don't have to reinvent the wheel, but we can get some guidelines, and that's what we need resources.
Should it be a stringent, and Matt, Patrick, I want you to engage in this, because I think the two of you is here where this is the real rubber hits the road kind of thing, because you're having to deal with it. I'm concerned that not only they can call and ask questions, but how much are we seeing this, I need a new officer, I want to get rid of this one, and say, oh, how did he do? Oh, he's a good guy, knowing why, click. And so we're missing this sort of, is there any way that we can look at that a little bit farther?
So I'll share a little bit, because I'm from Georgia, actually, and did most of my law enforcement career. And what Georgia did and what North Carolina does as well is the certification. Whenever someone leaves the organization, both certifications outline why they left and what's going on, so the next organization is well aware, and then of what any issues going on and why they've been released from the organization.
Because in Georgia, we've actually seen it's been amazing. It's the hip hop, the hip hop from one job to the next. And they're ones that's in trouble. They chop it, and it's a consistent pattern developing.
It's less and less.
It's getting there. Yes, I agree. Patrick, just your thoughts on this?
Well, I agree with their comments. I can tell you my experiences in law enforcement that when officers leave from agency to agency, every agency does an extensive background. That's to determine their liability and everything else associated with it. So there are standards in given states that follow that officer and that certification with their states. Everyone, for the most part, even though every state has its own standards, police standards, they're all based on the same criteria. So they're
And let me stop you because I agree with what you said, but I want to take it. Let's peel the onion back a little bit. That's the way it's supposed to happen. But we also know if you're down 2 officers, you got a 5-person force, and this person, it's harder sometimes, and you're tempted to hire that person in who's already certified. I don't have to send them to school. I don't have to pay for their schooling. I can get them in now. And yeah, they may have had a little, but he told me there was a problem with the police chief. And I agree the certification in Georgia, we've seen this, but how do we, I know what the story is. The question is, though, how does that seep down to the departments that, frankly, don't have the resources to do that and are under pressure to keep up their force?
I can only speak as a leader of Noble, as a police chief, that there's no standard that that's going to weigh out the need to have someone qualified and someone who will represent me, because basically when I hire someone and all the background investigation is done, that's what I expect.
You and Mr. Y'all are the standards. Y'all are the gold standards here, and that's why we're asking these questions. But I think in the bigger picture, I think it helps is we don't just look at the bigger picture. And we don't just discuss the problems. Those are all there, but these are the real nuts and bolts issues of, as I think it was Mr. Goff said, you got to find their mentality. There's a temperament to being on a police. There's a temperament to a police officer. I called it the state patrol face. It never smiled, but there's a temperament to this because you got to take it into account. You got to sort of eat everything and go for it and still pervert it fairly. A lot more stuff we can discuss here. I'm glad we're here with it. But one quick question. Does your department use body cameras?
Yes, sir.
Have y'all had a cost issue, especially with storage and other things with that?
Of course, sir.
That's the biggest one right there. And again, standard practice, we can put out best practices altogether, but if you've got a small community, that's a tough issue right there. And I do appreciate the chairman's indulgence over time, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Texas.
Let me thank the chairman and ranking member for this hearing, and let me say to all of the witnesses, every aspect of your testimony is vital to a construct that we in the Judiciary Committee now feel is long overdue, which is a policing agenda that acknowledges the basic facts that every human being deserves to go home to their family. And I hope that that is the most striking point that comes. And to our friends in law enforcement, you are no more diminished than Tamar Rice. You're no more diminished than Eric Garner, who, as his loving mother said, was her son, but he was a father of 6 and a grandfather. And maybe there is a grandchild now that he has missed who has been added to this wonderful family. And I hope that we don't have to take a litmus test to tell you all of our friends in law enforcement, all of our neighbors, all of the prayers, the time I flew to Dallas when those officers fell in their duty, or the many funerals that I've gone to of the men and women in blue. But we won't get together if we fall into the divide of the emerging white nationalism and white supremacy and begin to be the sea parted and separated from each other. So I want to just ask these questions that would hopefully get us to the point that we can resolve this. President Yoles, your predecessor, Chuck Catterbury, committed to working with the Congress to ensure data collection and reporting on police community encounters. Can you make the same commitment by ensuring that states and police departments will comply with the death and custody reporting law? And will you work with us in Congress to advance legislation, really a law enforcement agenda that would require data collection and reporting on other police community encounters and also to end racial profiling?
Man, we are very much committed in data collection. Data collection is some valuable information for us to know how to move forward, how to police properly. And there are a number of agencies that have the ability, they collect that data and it's available now. And it's usable, it's something that we can readily put our hands on and help us move in the right direction. The one concern that we do have is the smaller agencies and their capacity in order to be able to collect that data. And our concern would be that agencies that are small, having to collect that data may, in essence, affect their ability to be able to police.
We're going to respond.
To respond to that, I think the important thing is the collection of data needs to not be tied to any type of grant funding or anything like that, because agencies, that's counterproductive.
Do you believe that law enforcement, however, should not engage in racial profiling?
It's unconstitutional. I absolutely agree.
So any legislation that would make that simple point, you could take back and support?
I think the Constitution is very clear that it is illegal, and it's already on. It's there. It exists.
So then it would not be offensive to have legislation that provides grants and opportunities to ensure that does not happen?
I think it's unconstitutional. The law is already spoken.
I take that as a yes, and I thank you for that. Let me ask the question to Mr. Blake. Do you? We're speechless, but we're also speechless for the lives lost, whose names I will call. Clearly, you were racially profiled. Did you have an encounter, a language, a comment, ask who your name was, or anything of the sort?
No, I don't have time in my opening remarks, but I didn't have any sort of fight or flight response. I actually, if you watch the video closely, which we don't need to do again, but I was actually smiling. It was due to my previous life as a tennis player. I actually was under the misguided opinion that this may have been someone coming to give me a hug or a fan in some regard, and I find myself extremely lucky because I thought of what could have possibly happened had I thought this was someone coming to do me harm. After speaking to many officers since then, I asked them what would have happened if I'd put my arms up, if I'd actually made an effort to fight, or if my brother or one of my best friends was with me, or my wife, and had acted in any way accordingly.
You were clearly a man of color standing in front of a prominent hotel in downtown, in Manhattan.
In Manhattan, 42nd, right outside Grand Central Station, and had something else happened, I would
We need to pass the end racial profiling, among other very important legislation.
Because it happens far too often.
Thank you. Can I ask Dr. Goff, because of my time, let me respect all the witnesses. Let me as well thank Ms. Garcia for indicating it's black and brown, it's women, it's other individuals that may be profiled in different ways. But when we have statistics, and I want Reverend Sharpton to answer this as well, that clearly indicates the higher number of African Americans that are killed by law enforcement, I think the point I want to distinguish is this whole question that comes back to us about black on black crime. What I hope is that we'll pass H.R. 40, the Commission to Study Reparations, so we can address the systemic issue and the impact of slavery. But as it relates to this bias about, oh, black people kill themselves, make the distinction of color of law. Because what we're talking about is democracy. We're talking about the response. So if both of you answer the difference when law enforcement is engaged in the likes of Tamir Rice and Walter Scott and Michael Brown and Eric Garner, the color of law. Mr. Goff.
The gentlelady's time has expired. The witness may answer the question.
And Reverend Sharpton, please. No, go ahead, sir.
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman Jackson Lee. It's different because it feels different for the community. There's a difference between a neighbor who is violent, which is obviously it's scary. When the state says it's okay, it's terror. And we see that both in the responses from communities and in the responses, frankly, from law enforcement. But I think one of the things that you mentioned was really important. I want to put a fine point on the statistical element. The idea of black and black crime is a trope that gets raised in response to the idea that that's the reason why law enforcement is disparately using force in black communities. As distasteful as that may seem, it's a reasonable statistical question. It may be that crime or poverty are driving this, and there's no bias within law enforcement. But it's an answerable question as well. And there is not a study that takes into account crime rates, violent or otherwise, poverty rates, school achievement, housing inequality, that yields anything other than those elements, crime and poverty, are not sufficient to explain racial disparities, right? So we should be able to distinguish between the two.
Reverend Sharpton, briefly.
I concur with Dr. Goff's answer. I would also say, for the record that when we had campaigned against stop and frisk in New York, saying it was discriminatory, and the new administration came in and reduced it down to nothing, crime went down. Good. Crime is at an all-time low, so I'm not a nerd, but I can read and write. Crime went down with stop and frisk gone, and I think that we need to be very, very clear about that. And as far as black on black crime, I think in any community, most people are the victim of people of their same race. The problem in the black community is that we have fear of cops and robbers.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all the witnesses for appearing here today. We really do appreciate it. Earlier this year, we held a hearing on universal background checks, and a few weeks ago, this committee held a hearing on red flag legislation, and as I understand it, next week the committee will hold a hearing on assault weapons and gun violence in urban areas. And while I appreciate the majority's focus on gun control legislation and think it's important that this committee act in a responsible manner, I think that their efforts are misdirected. I'm a firm believer in the Second Amendment rights, and laws like the ones that are proposed by the majority this year, unfortunately, I'm afraid would do little more than restrict the rights of hardworking, law-abiding gun owners. The majority tends to focus on remedies which may sound good, but would have done little to stop the attacks that we've seen occur in this nation, and unfortunately, I'm afraid would do little to do anything about future attacks that might occur. But we do need to work together to find a way that we can make Americans safer. Mr. Yost, let me ask you, first of all, you are the national president of the FOP, the Fraternal Order of Police, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I want to thank you for being here today and for representing the men and women all across America who keep us all safe. And so thank you for that. In my home state, Ohio, it's a priority that those who shouldn't have firearms can't get access to those firearms. And that's what we ought to be working on, making sure that those people who aren't eligible can't get them. Guns should not be in the wrong hands. One way that this could be accomplished is to ensure that the NICS system, the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, is accurate, that it's up to date, that it's checked before obtaining a firearm, that it really works. Would you agree with that?
Sir, I think everyone in law enforcement will share the same opinion that we would like to take guns out of the hands of people who mean harm. We'd rather fix that rather than respond and explain why it happened. And certainly we are in favor of any process that's going to allow us greater ability to be able to do that. Our concern is and should be that it should have a strong due process to work through the issues.
Thank you. And I'm sure you're familiar with the gunfire detection technology that's out there today, and that some cities, including my city in Cincinnati, is currently using. And at the federal level, I would say that we should try to help cities and counties invest in that technology to help reduce gun violence. And in effect, it's a technology where you have microphones or you have sound wave equipment who can identify very quickly where this shooting has taken place. And you can oftentimes get there quickly, stop something that's happened, capture a criminal, pick up casings from the gun that's been fired. Do you have an opinion about that type of?
Well, my opinion is this, that law enforcement officers have a very difficult job, and any tools that we can give them to more effectively and efficiently do their job, it should absolutely be a priority. Our effectiveness to be able to respond accurately and at times of very stressful or very tense situations could be a matter of life and death. So any tools that we have available to law enforcement absolutely should be explored and made available.
Thank you. Let me follow up. Also, some of our most highly trained individuals about how to handle an active shooter situation, whether it's in a school or in a place of worship or anywhere, are law enforcement people. They're trained, they're the most highly trained people in our society. And they tend to retire after 25 years or whatever. They may be in their 50s and oftentimes are seeking other employment. It would seem that you have a source of trained people, perhaps as school resource officers in the schools. Do you have an opinion? Have you thought about that?
Actually, I served as a resource officer for several years. Best job I ever had, working in the schools, interacting with youth, changing attitudes towards law enforcement. I absolutely agree that a presence in school plays a pivotal role. In my agency, we started it long before it became a trend across the country, recognizing that it was important to be able to protect the safety of children in schools. And if you have a safe working school environment, you're going to have learning occur. So I absolutely, totally agree that there are definitely a positive element to resource officers, and that's the reason why it is across the country. The ability to include other people into protecting schools, any efforts we do to protect schools and protect the security within schools is well worth it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My time's expired, but I want to thank the committee and hope that we can work together to keep the American people as safe as possible. Thank you.
We will certainly do our best to do that, and I thank the gentleman. Gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am deeply concerned about the crisis of trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve, and this is true in my home city of Memphis, unfortunately, because we are not a stranger to the issue. From my perspective, there are several things we can do here in Congress to help. I've introduced bills to address many of these issues. One would be a way we can use technology and data to improve police-civilian interactions. The Police Camera Act, H.R. 120, would provide grants for state and local jurisdictions to purchase cameras for their officers. And we also need to collect data and technology to be useful about policing practice, to make law enforcement more responsive and responsible. And that's why I introduced the National Statistics on Deadly Force Transparency Act of 2019, which is H.R. 119. And communities need to feel safe that law enforcement agencies are accountable for their actions, that nobody is above the law. It's a shame the Department of Justice, which has been effective in the past, has stepped back from providing independent review and accountability for police practices. Along with Congressman Lacey Clay, we have introduced the Police Training and Independent Review Act, H.R. 125. At this point, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to introduce a letter of support for that act from the NAACP in June of 2019.
Without objection.
Thank you, sir. I'd like to ask Chief Hawkins what our bill would do, besides have sensitivity training for policemen about minorities and different areas that might not be of their history. It would say that the law enforcement agency that would determine if there should be a grand jury and determine whether or not there should be a prosecution and also prosecute the case should come from a jurisdiction other than that from which the law enforcement came. In my experience, I started my professional life after law school as the attorney for the police in Memphis. There's no question there's home cooking. Many people from law enforcement go and work as investigators for the DA, and it's almost like a farm team. And so from my perspective, you can't have absolute independence if the DA has to go to the grand jury, and if the DA indicts a policeman, gets a policeman indicted, then the police, as we saw in New York, and I think it might have been in the, I don't know if it was the Garner case or another one, but the police all went out against the DA. They protested.
Are you saying change jurisdiction, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, sir.
You think that's a good idea?
I think so, sir. That gives an unbiased ability to gauge the facts of the situation and facts of the case and a good review of it.
And Mr. Davis, do you have any thought about that type of concept?
Yes, sir, I do. It was actually two recommendations in the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. The first would start with the investigation, that it should be an investigation by the department, not overseeing the officer who's involved in the shooting.
It would be a separate total law enforcement agency.
Yes, so that I, as a detective, don't have to interview or investigate somebody I worked with for 20 years. The second part would be that as prosecutors and police work together on a daily basis and just the things necessary to make communities safe, that you then go outside that jurisdiction as well so that you can have a separate jurisdiction, look at the prosecution, convene a grand jury. So I would agree with you. This level of independence is important to build trust in a process that people think is so insular and so designed to benefit the officer that we need that. And I said those were 2 recommendations from the President's Task Force.
And now I'm going to take a long shot when you're not supposed to ask a question where you don't have some kind of an idea of what the answer is going to be. The gentleman from the Fraternal Order of Police, and I appreciate your position, and I'm a former ICP person, but do you not see the benefit that might give to law enforcement, everybody else seen as a fair shake?
Sir, I can tell you that I think that a collaborative effort on a local level, which law agencies are based on local jurisdictions, that should be the very first part of reviewing any systemic problems there are within agencies. There are processes within each state of how they handle them, and we support those positions that are taken within those states to investigate crimes or incidents.
Thank you, sir. Later this week, I'm going to introduce the Deadly Force Independent Review Act, which will provide independent review of instances when a federal law enforcement officer has used deadly force. I think that'll help too. Reverend Sharpton, what do you think? You've been active for many years on all these issues. What do you think are the most important reforms that we can take up to try to cure these problems? What works best?
I think that what we need is clear legislation on where the police are to be dealing with federal charges in excessive force. What raises to the bar of a federal crime? It is too nebulous now. That secondly, that we would have some preventative measures in, like cameras on police that cannot be turned off, and that when consent decrees are audited by the Justice Department, they remain, even if administrations change, that they remain. And that we have constant reviews by the Justice Department with the department there on policing around the country, particularly looking for pattern and practices. I think if we start with legislation, not just with feel-good programs, but legislation, so police know they're accountable legislatively, not just on a local and state level, which is what had to happen with voting and other things in the civil rights era.
Thank you, sir, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate all the witnesses being here. Yeah, and I appreciate the comments. It does help if you have someone who is not bigoted or prejudiced against the person that they're either pursuing or investigating. And hopefully at some point our Attorney General will have somebody independent review the investigation and the determinations made by Peter Strzok and Lisa Page. They obviously hate President Trump, but I was concerned about the exchange by Dr. Goff, Ms. Mcdonald. I would offer for the record this from PANS, from David Johnson, Trevor Tress, Nicole Burkle, Carly Taylor, Joseph Cesario, officer characteristics and racial disparities in fatal officer-involved shootings. I didn't know, and it would ask that be made part of the record.
Without objection.
And also, Ms. McDonald, I had a couple articles from her, one about Dial of Truth from City Journal, summer 1999, one from August 31st, 2000, the Manhattan Institute. I'll offer those for the record. But thank you. But in looking at this that my staff just brought me from this study Ms. McDonald references, I don't know the statistics underlying this. I'm just reading from their results. It said, we find no evidence of anti-Black or anti-Hispanic disparities across shootings, and white officers are not more likely to shoot minority civilians than non-white officers. Instead, race-specific crime strongly predicts civilian race. This suggests that increasing diversity among officers by itself is unlikely to reduce racial disparity in police shootings. I don't know the underlying statistics, but that's what it says on its face. But during my days as a prosecutor, I'd ride along with law enforcement, and I'll never forget, we had a threat in my home county against some law enforcement folks, and I went with them, and he was supposed to be there and have an arsenal. But there is nothing like standing outside the door. And I was 4 years in the Army. We were never in combat, but lots of training. But standing outside the door of somebody that's threatened to kill the people that you're with and knowing that person has an arsenal and you're about to go in his home. And officers all over the country do that each day and put their life at risk so that others hopefully don't end up killed. And as a judge, you know, I can acknowledge not all officers are paragons of virtue, but it seemed to me from what I've dealt with, there is a lower percentage of bad apples in law enforcement than there is in the general population. But one of the things that was said earlier about the family, I'll never forget the testimony of a gang leader. He had been convicted of murder. His attorney had wisely advised him not to testify, but he refused the advice of his attorney on sentencing, took the stand for one reason. He made it very clear, I'm not following my lawyer's instructions because I can't sit there anymore. I sat through this whole trial and listened to people talk badly about my gang. He was a gang leader, and he had killed a guy. And he said, I'm sick of it. That's my family. I don't know my father. My mother's never around. That is my family, and I couldn't sit still and not say something about people bad-mouthing my family. And boy, that comes home. He never knew his father. He never had a mother that was around. I just can't help but think if he had had one or both of those, he wouldn't have ended up in my courtroom having a jury sentence him to life in prison. So there are a lot of things we need to look at, and I appreciate the effort of everybody trying to get back to more civility. But I hope that we don't overlook the importance of the family and what it used to be in America. But I appreciate all your time. I've read your statements, and thank you for going to the trouble to be here. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this very important hearing, and I want to thank each of the witnesses for their testimony today. Let me begin by saying that the men and women who serve in law enforcement in this country are, for the most part, brave, dutiful, honorable, and they keep us safe. That is not a question for debate. However, it's undeniable that there is an epidemic of police shootings of unarmed civilians in our country, and by failing to recognize that, we're contributing to the problem. I want to point out the fact that I believe that police should be accountable just as the citizens who they seek to hold accountable. And so that means that just as citizens have to be questioned by police after an incident happens, why should it be that police are protected from having to answer questions from law enforcement agencies when they have been involved in a police shooting, when they've killed somebody or when they have choked someone to death? Why should they have a week of respite with a legal right to not be questioned about what happened because they have it in their employment agreement, their collective bargaining agreement? So these kinds of rules that insulate police from accountability need to be removed from our practice, and that's why I'm going to be filing what will be called the Cool-Off Period Elimination Act, so that we can make sure that police officers are treated the same way citizen suspects are treated. And with respect to investigating police misconduct, what happens is the same agency that employs them is the one that does the investigation. The same prosecution authority that would prosecute the case is the one that presents the case to a grand jury if it ever gets to that point. But it usually takes, in many cases, years before it gets to that point, and it's kind of lulling the people to sleep, the public to sleep, and then you announce with regularity, that there will be no prosecution. And so to alleviate that, for the last couple of terms of Congress, I have filed the Grand Jury Reform Act, which would cause police shootings to be investigated by a state's highest law enforcement authority, such as in the case of Georgia, the GBI, Georgia Bureau of Investigation. That would assume investigatory authority, and also an independent prosecutor would be appointed by the governor to preside over these investigations, and then the results would have to be submitted to a judge in open court, not a grand jury, but a judge in open court for a preliminary hearing, and that would be the way that these cases are disposed of. And in the event that a jurisdiction declined to prosecute an officer for what might be a obvious offense, like the Eric Garner situation, live and on camera, choked a man to death, why shouldn't the federal government be able to prosecute for murder? In that way, you bring about some accountability. When police officers are held accountable, it sends a strong message to others that they need to conform their conduct to society's norms. And so I look forward for y'all's support on the Grand Jury Reform Act, and also the Police Accountability Act and the Cool-Off Period Act. Let me last say that a lot of our law enforcement officers are straight from the military. And when they went to the military as young men, they were trained in terms of what kind of instinct that they should have. General Mad Dog Mattis got his nickname because he said that it was during a training session, he told his Marines to be polite, be professional, but have a plan to kill everybody you meet. And he said that a good soldier follows orders, but a true warrior wears his enemy's skin like a poncho. That is the military ethos going into battle. And when you have a police officer that's been trained in that way, it's hard when that police officer gets trained to become a police officer to put aside that instinct that has been bred into them and put into operation suddenly a protect and serve mentality. So we've got a lot of local law enforcement who are military veterans, and there are also reservists and National Guardsmen who are trained to kill, to occupy and destroy. And they're roaming our streets, and the more police officers die every year of suicide than they do from being killed in the line of duty. So our police officers are under a lot of stress out there. It plays out in terms of their reactions to situations, their overreaction to situation. And then people of color are predominantly the victims of that. And so I think we need to take a comprehensive view in terms of mental health as it is applied to our law enforcement officers. And with that, I've run out of time. I don't have a chance to ask anybody for any feedback, but I want everyone to think about that carefully, and let's work on that issue. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I would like to briefly address the members of the audience in the hearing room today. We welcome you and respect your right to be here. We also ask in turn for your respect as we proceed with the business of the committee today. It's the intention of the committee to proceed with this hearing, but it is against the rules to permit any applause or for that matter, negative applause or disruption of any kind, so please refrain. The gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Reverend Sharpton, your current MSNBC co-worker, Joe Scarborough, is my former congressman. And when Joe Scarborough served in the Congress, he had quite a bit to say about your contribution to the national discussion. It was in the 106th Congress that Joe Scarborough filed House Concurrent Resolution 270 entitled Condemning the Racist and Anti-Semitic Views of the Reverend Al Sharpton. Mr. Scarborough's resolution began by saying, whereas the Reverend Al Sharpton has referred to members of the Jewish faith as blood-sucking Jews and Jew bastards. So my question to you is, does Mr. Scarborough's assertion that you said these things, is that true, or did you not say those things?
They are patently untrue. I never said that.
Okay.
Can I finish my answer?
No, it's actually my time, but you will be able to
Well, I thought you raised the question.
So the next question
Can I
relates to
answer
Mr.
the
Scarborough's
question?
second comment. He says, whereas the Reverend...
Since aspersions were cast on the witness will be permitted to answer.
No, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. Aspersions weren't cast. I asked the witness if
You asked, was it true that I said that?
I can't reclaim my time, Mr. Chairman?
Witness, you will have your time. The witness will be permitted to answer.
You asked me, was that true? And the answer is no, that was not true. And as you know, Mr. Scarborough and I work very closely together. He comes to National Action Network conventions. I think he's a great guy, and we do each other's shows often.
Mr. Scarborough also said...
Excuse me. The gentleman the timekeeper will add 30 seconds to Mr. Gates's time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman will state his parliamentary inquiry.
Is it appropriate for a member of the body to personally attack a witness before the body? Or shall I say, can a congressman's words be taken down in the event that he casts aspersions on a witness?
We ask everyone to adhere to rules of decorum. The gentleman will proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Joe Scarborough then wrote, whereas the Reverend Al Sharpton has referred to members of the Jewish faith as white interlopers and diamond merchants. Have you ever referred to members of the Jewish faith as white interlopers or diamond merchants?
No, sir. I referred to one in Harlem, an individual who I didn't even know was Jewish, as an interloper, and said I should never refer to his race. I said that I was against those that were using apartheid diamonds. And when I did a funeral in Crown Heights in '91, because we were boycotting Oppenheimer and those that were selling diamonds from apartheid South Africa. In the same sermon, I'm trying to, may I finish my answer, sir? Am I allowed to finish my answer?
I'm allowed to reclaim my time.
You asked a question and I'm answering it.
Yeah, I got a few more.
Well, and I have a few more answers.
I can't wait.
Well, apparently you do because you don't want me to answer.
No, I want to
know. So since you raised it, let me finish. I also talked about people snatching pocketbooks that are in the. I'm not filibustering anything. I'm answering your question.
Everyone will suspend, please.
Mr. Chairman, a parliamentary inquiry.
Everyone will suspend.
Parliamentary inquiry.
Gentlelady will state a parliamentary inquiry.
It will be in the form of an inquiry statement. Is it appropriate for a member to do a constant tirade of attacking the witness and then not allowing the witness to answer?
That is not, my personal opinion is that it's not proper, but that is not a proper parliamentary inquiry.
That's a statement to the gentleman.
Gentleman controls the time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Scarborough continued, whereas the Reverend Al Sharpton led a protest in the Crown Heights neighborhood and marched next to a protester with a sign that read, "The white man is the devil." Did you march next to a sign that said?
I have no recollection of that. I've marched in many things where there were signs that I did or did not agree with.
Scarborough
and I would say that if I was aware of that, I would have said that I would not want to have that sign.
Witness and not just have him continue to.
Well, then you shouldn't ask me a question if you don't want an answer.
I want to know if you said them. You could say yes or no. You said
no, well, I cannot answer Mr. Chairman on yes or no when he's asking me whether or not.
The witness is obviously disrupting the committee.
The witness, first of all, this has nothing to do with policing. Since he wants to make the subject Joe Scarborough and I, then let me answer it. It had nothing. Last I know, Joe Scarborough nor I are members of the police department or has anything to do with excessive force. But I'm loving to engage this if he lets me finish.
What is outrageous is a matter of opinion. The gentleman controls the time.
Mr. Chairman, I asked that a minute be restored.
The gentleman controls the time.
So you're not going to restore my time?
No.
Joe Scarborough continues, the Reverend Al Sharpton's fierce demagoguery incited violence. riots, and murder in the Crown Heights section of Brooklyn. Do you agree or disagree with that statement?
As a matter of fact, the New York State did a extensive study on the Crown Heights riots. Said I was not even there until after there was death of Yanko Roosevelt. I was not even called by the family until the day after.
Thank you, Mr.
We
Sharpton.
had nothing to do with it. When I came to Crown Heights, I led the first nonviolent march there.
Are you really? All right, fine. Mr. Sharpton, have you ever referred to African Americans who disagree with you as cocktail sip Negroes?
I have.
Have you ever referred to African Americans who disagree
Chairman,
with you?
I have a parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman will state his parliamentary inquiry.
If a congressperson is persistently about a non-germane matter, is it proper?
I think the gentleman makes a fair point, but the rules provide members with very wide latitude.
Parliamentary inquiry.
Gentleman will state his parliamentary inquiry.
Does it violate any rules of decorum for a member to read specifically verbatim from a document filed in the congressional records as a resolution?
The gentleman from Florida may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Have you ever referred to African Americans who disagree with you as yellow and then the N-word?
I don't know that I've referred to people as names. I don't know if it's because they disagree with me, but I have said things about blacks and whites. I'm glad you made it clear that I don't only attack whites. Thank you for that.
Have you ever said that? Have you ever referred to African Americans who disagree with you as Negro militants?
I didn't know that was a derogatory statement.
I didn't say it was. Just ask if you used it.
I don't know. I don't recall.
Have you ever said, if the Jews want to get it on, tell them to pin their yarmulkes back and come over to my house?
No, there was a man named Mordecai Levy who had been charged with some terrorist acts who threatened to march on me and several other activists in New Jersey. And he said he was going to come deal with my hairstyle. And I'm referring to his hairstyle. I said for him to pin it and come on. I was not talking about all Jews.
Well, you
no.
said those words.
No, I said about Mordecai Levy.
Have you said, I'm in hell already, I'm in Israel?
Yeah, because I had been threatened that if I came over to deal with
question.
First of all,
I
believe that you can deal with the decorum of the Congress, but you cannot disrespect a witness. You cannot ask a question and tell the witness he can't answer the question.
Is permitted to answer a question.
You're welcome to answer them. How about
well, then let me answer, sir.
Okay.
Let me answer, because I'm enjoying this. I think that you have.
You're at a committee about policing.
Don't get upset. Calm down. Calm down. You're yelling. Calm down. I think that I'm trying to answer your last question.
Gentleman will be permitted. The time of the gentleman has expired. The witness may answer the question.
The one about offing the pigs. Answer that one.
The witness may answer the question. The time of the gentleman has expired. The witness may answer the question.
The question that he raised, what I was saying was clearly that I have disagreed with blacks and whites. I've used language graphically sometime to do so, some of which I've grown beyond, but none of which shows anything other than I am an equal opportunity attacker. And I'm glad that Joe Scarborough and I both are equal opportunity attackers that now work together.
Mr. Chairman, I ask to be recognized for unanimous consent request.
The gentleman will state his unanimous consent request.
Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to introduce the Scarborough resolution as a part of the committee's permanent record.
I object. Who's next? The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have a motion.
Now that
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Fox audition is over?
No, I'm saying gentleman
Who?
from
Okay, so the audition's over. Okay, just checking. Mr. Chairman, now that we just wasted 5 minutes that had nothing to do with the subject of how we make our communities safer, both black and white, how we make our officers safe, I want to start with Mr. Yost, who is in my district and represents Fraternal Order Police. We met with Fraternal Order Police last year, and I brought in Noble and Fraternal Order Police, and I thought we had a good meeting. But what I want to ask on the record is that we come together. Those recommendations from the 21st century policing model, those that the FOP are behind, can you all submit to us the recommendations you're for, the ones you're against, and the ones you're neutral on, so we will know where there's common ground? And I think that Noble has adopted the entire report. If you all could give us that, then at least we know where the two law enforcement groups stand on the 21st century policing recommendations.
Yes, sir. I absolutely can forward that information to you. It is documented. It is prepared, and I can send it. We can make it part of the record. Okay.
Second, Dr. Goff lists some recommendations in his testimony. I don't know if you have them, but if you could, there are 5 recommendations. If you can look at those recommendations and get us your position on those 5, it would be very helpful. Second, part of your testimony, you talk about making it a federal offense to target law enforcement officers, which I agree with. You use as an example Dallas and Baton Rouge, and Baton Rouge was very personal to us. But I want to point out that that's not necessarily apples to apples when you talk about community police relations. Baton Rouge was sovereign citizens. They're a domestic terrorist organization, and they target police officers. So that has a lot less to do with community relationships with the police, and I didn't want it to seem that way. But since you did mention Baton Rouge, which was sovereign citizens, then I'll point you next door to St. John Parish, where we lost 2 officers and 2 were ambushed. The thing that both of those incidents have in common, besides the loss of multiple police officers, is that they were outgunned by the perpetrator. Both of them had AR-15s. So when we mention assault weapons ban, let me just ask you very specifically, in those cases, were the police outgunned by the perpetrator?
Well, sir, thank you for bringing up Brandon Nielsen and Jeremy Trish. Both were friends of mine. That incident occurred probably 10, 15 minutes from my house, so I'm very much familiar with it. Yes, I would say absolutely they were armed with weapons, and the officers were not prepared for what happened.
And the Baton Rouge incident was also AR-15. So when we talk about assault weapons, we're really talking about weapons of mass destruction and the question of whether they have a place on the streets in a civilized community. And I won't put you on record as whether you're for or against assault weapons ban, but I would like to ask you, are you troubled by the fact that ordinary citizens are more equipped and more weaponized than the police officers in many incidents?
Well, as a law enforcement officer, I'm very much concerned about our ability and the safety of officers.
The other thing I would point to, and Dr. Goff, I'll ask this question to you, or maybe even Chief Hawkins, the mentality that we have in terms of police. So we have a warrior mentality, we can have a guardian mentality. And in the warrior mentality, you are rewarded in terms of how many stops you make, how many tickets you issue, how many summons you give out, which encourages that mindset. And then the guardian mentality, it's how often you engage with citizens. So in that setting, and my time is going to run out, and I hope you comment on it, but let's take the Alton Sterling case as an example. He sold DVDs outside the same store for years. So when there's a call to a police officer to come check on what Alton is doing, whether he may or may not have a weapon, where is the breakdown in community policing that the police that responds to that does not know who he is? I mean, if you're the same person in front of the same store, does the police officers never go get a sandwich or a drink from those community stores? Where's the breakdown? I'm trying to understand, why did the police not already have a relationship with a guy who has a business set up in front of another business for years? So if you can answer that in the terms of community policing, guardian relationship versus warrior. With that, I'll yield back the rest of my time.
I'll start real quick. In regards to the guardian and warrior mentality, the way that you described it, sir, I believe in both, but I don't believe it in that perspective. I believe it as the citizen that I am of my community, I'm a mother. So I'm gonna be a warrior if someone comes for my family. In that aspect, law enforcement are warriors in protecting the community. That's what we train for. That's what we prepare for, so that if we're outgunned, if we have better tactics. But the mindset, it's a dual relationship of the guardian. We're there because we're protective. And having community policing is more than just a notion. It is the actual engagement of knowing everyone that is selling anything in that community, whether it be ice cream or a teacher. So that comes with a lot of work, that comes with effort and action and proactive discussion, and addressing all the biases, all the theories that you may have in your mind personally, in training it, and even acknowledging the fact that you might personally have some type of belief. But when we address it and we have talks and discussions with our community members and actually bring out hardcore discussions, then we can get past that. So I believe personally that there is the ability to have a warrior and guardian mindset work together.
The gentleman's time has expired. Upon consideration, I will withdraw my previous objection. The document will be entered into the record. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I was reviewing your prior answer, Reverend Sharpton. You are cited in a Washington Examiner piece, July 30th, 2019, as having said, if the Jews want to get it on, tell them to pin their yarmulkes back and come over to my house. And in your response to my question, you said you were just referring to one person. So here is my very limited question for you, Reverend. Were you misquoted in this story when you say the Jews and them, referring to a plural group of people rather than one person you seem to have a grievance with?
Am I allowed to answer? My name is Sharpton, not Lewandowski. I will answer the question if I'm allowed.
Please. We know your name, sir. Go ahead and answer.
And you then know that I'm going to answer. I was referring to an incident and a threat to come to my home by Mordecai Levy and to the homes of, I believe, Reverend Daughtry and others. How the Examiner, I think you said, or someone else wrote, I'm not looking at it, so I do not know whether they misquoted me or not. I do know what I said and who I was referring to.
Well, did you say them?
I just said that I'm not looking at the statement. I do not. You're talking about a situation that happened in 1991. If I said them, the, or those, I don't know. I know that incident and I know what I was referring to. And a man threatening to come to our home who had that kind of criminal record. And I had two young children, I think under 5 years old.
Thank you. I appreciate the answer.
Again, I'm not Lewandowski. Let me talk. I'll talk. I'll testify before this committee.
You know, so is it your belief that
if I said them or not, would that help or hurt excessive force of policing?
Well, I think it's pretty significant when someone wants to come and preach to us.
Mr. Chairman, point of parliamentary inquiry.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Chairman.
Point of parliamentary inquiry. Point of parliamentary inquiry.
Someone else did first. The gentleman will state his point of...
I don't believe you talk about the people that come before you.
The gentleman will suspend. The gentleman will state his point of parliamentary inquiry.
Mr. Chairman, when a witness is asked a question in a hearing before this Judiciary Committee, do our rules provide that the witness is permitted to answer the question?
The witness is permitted to answer the question.
I have a parliamentary...
But the member controls the time.
Parliamentary inquiry.
Hold on. The member controls the time. If the member judges that the question is answered to his satisfaction, he may go on to another question. The gentlelady will state her point of parliamentary inquiry.
When a witness is attempting to answer the question, is it the rules of this committee that the witness be allowed to answer the question? And is it also in the decorum of this committee to not badger the witness if the witness is attempting to answer the question?
The member, well, there are two answers. The member controls the time. If the member thinks that the question has been answered to his satisfaction, he may cut off the answer and go to a further question. However, it is not permitted to badger a witness. We do afford members considerable latitude, but badgering witnesses is inappropriate, and our committee should not conduct itself in that manner. It is expected that all parties to these proceedings comport themselves with decorum and professionalism, and at all times in a manner that reflects creditably on the House of Representatives. House rules require the chair to maintain order and decorum, and I will do so. The gentleman controls the time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ain't having no march. I believe in fighting. Well, fight then. Ain't nobody holding you. I'll off the man. We'll off him. Plenty of crackers walking around here tonight. Did you say those words?
I do not recall saying I will not march. I think for the last 40 years I've marched. I think that you're referring to, and I'm not sure, but I think you're referring to when I was dealing with some people that said that they don't want to march and that they're going to off people. And I told them there are plenty of people walking around that they called the name. They're not offing anybody because I felt that they were just trying to disrupt our asking people to march. So in the context of I was quoting as I said, the reference made about I don't want to march.
And astrology and mathematics before Socrates and them Greek homos ever got around to it. Did you say that, Mr. Sharpton?
I talked about African history, and I talked about how we had dealt with astrology as well as mathematics and philosophy and religion in Africa.
But you referred to people as Greek homos, didn't you?
I do not recall how I referred to anyone. And you'd have to cite.
Do you think that your bigoted statements in 1991 are excusable just because they were in 1991?
I think that any statement that I've made that was wrong, I have clearly said that we should not make bigoted statements, including me. I also think that to distort, I think that also to distort.
Have you made bigoted statements?
Will the gentleman yield?
You can ask all the questions you want, but I'm going to answer the question.
Will the gentleman yield?
When you call Greek homos, when you talk about white crackers, those are bigoted statements.
I think I made it clear that I was quoting what somebody said. Yelling and getting upset is beneath your office. You should calm down.
The gentleman will state his point of order.
Once again, Mr. Chairman, after a sustained attack on the character of a witness that has been called by people on this panel, and that panel then attacks that witness in a sustained, deliberate manner, which is non-germane to the subject at hand, is it appropriate for a member to ask that the offending member's words be taken down?
It is not under the rules appropriate. The time is the gentleman's.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would note these are highly relevant to the issues that we're facing. Reverend Sharpton has come before the House Judiciary Committee
the clock should be running.
As a purported expert on policing, and yet his bigoted statements undermine the bipartisan work we should be doing to ensure that all citizens are able to come together and have safe communities.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. How is this germane?
Point of order.
How is this line of inquiry germane? And if it's not germane, is it appropriate?
To the point, may I speak to the point?
He cited germane.
So it's hard to know if you're setting a specific rule that says that this is not allowed, that we can then rule on.
Well, is there such a rule? I don't think we should allow our, Mr. Chairman, we have had a series, we've had a witness who came before us 2 days ago, Mr. Lewandowski, who totally contemptuously dealt with this panel, and now we have a reverse of that. We have one of our members doing the same thing to a witness who we have called. I don't think it is within our best practices to allow our process to get down to the level that we have now sunk. And I'm asking the chairman to, in the wise use of discretion, to rule that the gentleman from Florida's line of inquiry with this specific witness, who he's trying to attack his characters, no question about that, but
I'm reading his own words back.
Doing it in a sustained way, and doing.
I have the time, Mr. Chairman.
And not having uttered
What is it? Regular order. Is this a point of order?
Point of order, Mr. Gates. You don't have the floor.
The gentleman is being heard on the point of order.
Will I be heard on the point of order?
The gentleman is being heard on the point of order.
Not having uttered a single word of relevance to the issue at hand, is it appropriate for this committee to allow the misuse of this platform to attack the character of a witness? I mean, this is taking our process down to a level that we should never allow it to descend to. And I'm objecting to us wallowing in the mud down here with these comments. I mean, it's not whether or not it's true or false, it's the fact that it's non-germane.
To the point.
The chair will rule on the point. The chair will rule on the point of order. Although the gentleman's comments may be obnoxious, although they may
I object to that. Point of order. That is an improper characterization.
The gentleman's
of the member of the
comments
committee.
may be characterized as whatever you want to characterize them as.
I have a point of order that your words be taken down and referred.
Oh, woe is me. I pick a fight and now I need help.
Under the rules, the gentleman has wide latitude both on the question of germaneness and on the language that he uses. And unfortunately, under the rules, I cannot overrule him. The gentleman will proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You sold your life story, Mr. Sharpton, to your own charity. How much money did your charity pay you for the rights to tell your story?
Parliamentary inquiry. Mr. Chairman, this is an outrage, and the question is whether you can impugn the motives and or insult or badger the witness or cost or characterize his presence at this table.
The gentlelady was not recognized.
Well, I have a parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady was not recognized. All right. Stop the clock. Just stop. All right, you'll state the parliamentary inquiry.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the gentleman from Georgia made a point about a witness that we had just 2 days ago, which the impugning of the motive, the character destruction was not in the course of our questioning. What I say to our good friend from Florida, that you are now not only not being germane, but you are pointedly attacking the character and in addition, bringing up information
it is not
that, well, let me just finish. Bringing up information, it's an inquiry. Bringing up information that is a character destroying. And the question is, in the questioning of a witness, can you use items that refer to the witness's character and demeaning the witness's character? Is that an appropriate line of questioning?
Whether it is an appropriate line of questioning is not relevant. But with respect to the parliamentary inquiry, questioning a witness's character and motives, which may go to ascertaining the credibility to give to the testimony, we have always given very wide latitude, and the answer has to be that I cannot object to that. The gentleman will proceed.
How much money did your charity pay you personally, for the right to tell your life story?
My charity owed a certain amount of money to me and asked, could they use that money to have the right to sell any rights to my life, be it documentary, one-man play, or other items that they have already began reaping dividends. They would have had to pay me the same sum anyway because it was owed to me.
Was that sum
so
over
the
$500,000?
answer, can I finish?
Was it over $500,000?
Can I finish? Whatever the sum was, whatever the sum
gave you to tell your life story, because I think most people would see that as
charity
fraud.
Charity again owed me a certain amount of money that they would have had to pay anyway, and I agreed to allow them,
or less than $500,000 that his charity paid him for his life story.
Time.
I allowed them to use those funds to have my
was it
right.
more than $500,000?
Gentleman will suspend. His time has expired. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before I begin, let me just take a moment to thank Mrs. Carr for her presence here today, of course, for sharing her thoughts with this committee. What Mrs. Carr experienced, no parent should ever have to experience. No parent should ever have to bury their child, particularly when that child has been killed by those who were sworn to protect
and serve. And so I want to thank you for turning your pain into progress, for your willingness to share the story in such an authentic and compelling way. Today I will be reintroducing the anti-chokehold legislation that you made reference to in your testimony, and we will be renaming it the Eric Garner Excessive Use of Force Prevention Act in tribute to your son. Thank you again for all that you have done. I want to enter into the record and ask unanimous consent a tweet from Joe Scarborough from July 29th of 2019. The entire line of inappropriate questioning from Matt Gaetz was based purportedly on a resolution that had been introduced over 20 years ago by then Congressman Joe Scarborough. The tweet reads, "Thanks to those reminding me of how stridently Al Sharpton and I opposed each other 20 years ago. We take pride in our friendship today because of that history, recognizing Jesus' words that all have fallen short of God's glory, and we should forgive each other 70 times 7 times." Unanimous.
That objection, that will be entered into the record.
And let me also thank Reverend Sharpton for continuing to be a voice for the voiceless, a defender of the disenfranchised, for all that you've done throughout the country in the context of this issue, police violence, and for the manner in which you've stood with individuals over the years in New York, whether that was Amadou Diallo, who was felled by 42 shots at his doorstep, unarmed, African man, whether that was Patrick Dorismond, a security guard who the so-called Mayor Rudolph Giuliani maligned by releasing his juvenile records. Turned out that Mr. Dorismond was actually an altar boy who went to the same Catholic school as the so-called Mayor Giuliani. Whether it was Sean Bell, who was shot dead, 50 shots on the eve of his wedding, whether it was Omar Edwards, who was an off-duty black police officer who was killed in Harlem, of course, whether that was Eric Garner, who was killed for all the world to see, unarmed, and given a death sentence for selling loose cigarettes. So thank you, Reverend Sharpton. In all of those instances, unfortunately, there was no measure of justice to the officer who had engaged in the act resulting in the death of those individuals. What can be done to create a greater degree of accountability, recognizing that, in my view, the majority of police officers are there to protect and serve with the best of intentions. But like any avenue of human endeavor in life, there are bad apples. And when a bad apple engages in an action that results in the death of an individual, what can be done to make sure that there's a greater degree of accountability?
You're asking me?
Reverend Sharpton.
I think that we need to have, and thank you for your comments on my work, and I thank the gentleman from Florida for allowing me to straighten out the distortion and lies on the record that I've been misquoted. He's done a great service to my reputation. I want to say I think that the federal government has obligation, and the Congress can initiate that, to really set certain laws in place that become federal law, that override state laws, and that in many ways stop state prosecutors and others from mishandling police matters. One, by having independent review, a department in the Justice Department, a group in the Justice Department that can handle that and determine whether to go criminal or consent decrees of its police forces. Things like training must reach a certain bar, otherwise they violate federal law. And you have to have things, again, like cameras on police that has to be mandated on how they're handled. There must be federal standards on policing subject to criminal or civil law that cannot change by administrations. And I think we have not answered what all of that has happened in the last decade or more. We have not answered that with any new federal legislation. I think it is important we do, and I'm glad you're beginning again with this Eric Garner chokehold law.
Thank you, Reverend Sharpton. Time has expired.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd first observe that every police officer that I've spoken with on the subject strongly supports body cameras because they provide an accurate record of encounters, and that protects every honest officer just as it protects every honest citizen. And I saw the video of the killing of Eric Garner, and it is appalling. Particularly when you consider the fact the only crime that was even alleged was selling loose cigarettes. I mean, who would make that a crime to begin with, let alone one to be enforced by lethal force? And Mr. Blake, the attack on you clearly appeared unprovoked. I'm just curious, what was the justification the officer used for that attack?
Apparently, the suspect that they claimed I looked like was making credit card fraud. It was ordering bags and expensive clothes to that hotel on fraudulent credit cards.
He thought you were somebody else when he attacked you like that.
Apparently, that's what he claimed.
Did he ask for any ID?
No, he never even declared that he was an officer at NYPD. I only knew later when I saw badges on the other 4 officers that were on the scene.
Whatever the statistics are, and I tend to trust the accuracy of of Ms. Mcdonald's study, but clearly that is not the public perception, at least among a significant portion of the population. I used to work for the former chief of the LAPD, the legendary Edward Davis. He was chief from 69 to 77 or 78, I think. During the time he was chief, crime nationally exploded. It went up 50%. In Los Angeles under Chief Davis, it actually went down. And he had he was not adverse to the use of force, but he had a very unique philosophy of law enforcement. He once told me, it is not the job of the police department to enforce the law. He said, that's the job of every citizen. The police department is there to help. He's the chief who pioneered Neighborhood Watch in Los Angeles. He introduced community-based policing. He introduced the LA Basic Car Plan because he viewed law enforcement as a partnership between citizens and police. And of course, the Basic Car Plan says we're going to become a partnership with the local neighborhoods. We're going to have the same officers in the same neighborhoods who know the people who are involved. And it seems to me that philosophy works. It's the essence of law enforcement in a free society, in a self-governing society. In fact, he was very much opposed to gun control laws that would disarm law-abiding citizens because he believed that law-abiding citizens were the first line of defense and an important part of that partnership to enforce the laws that are enacted on behalf of all of us. But ultimately, that philosophy requires a mutual respect between the police officers and the neighborhoods and between the neighborhoods and the police officers. Clearly, we've lost that. And maybe it's too much to ask for in this day and age when we can't seem to summon a degree of mutual respect among ourselves on this committee. But I would ask Commander Yos and Chief Ron Davis, you have obviously different perspectives, but together a great deal of experience with law enforcement. How do we go about restoring that mutual respect that's essential for law enforcement in a free society?
Well, I thank you for that question because I really think that's the root of everything that we should be talking about here today. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter what we do or who we are. At the end of the day, it really is all about the relationships. And you apply this to law enforcement, it goes back to our same community. Our communities, we're allowed to do certain things as law enforcement officers, and what gives us the right to do it is the very trust of the people who have empowered us to do that. And along the way, we've clearly lost that way. We've lost our way because we've gotten changes in technology, changes in the way we interact, interpersonal skills, social media, all of these things have changed our world and have changed it drastically.
I think the technology would help, though. I mean, with DNA and GPS and surveillance cameras, it should make the job easier.
I agree. I don't disagree with that. A point I am making is that at the end of the day, it really comes down to the relationships. It's easy to point out and say that there's us and there's them, and the reality is there's people on both sides of this issue. And those relationships that we foster are what's going to actually make the difference at the end of the day. It doesn't matter what we're doing. In this case, we're talking about law enforcement. We need to get back to the basics. We need to have an understanding on what's important for law enforcement and what's important to our communities. And when we have that dialogue and we have that understanding, we can find solutions to real problems and tear down some of the walls and the destruction that we're seeing across this country.
And I assume that is not involving the federalization and nationalization of police policy, but rather getting back to the neighborhood level.
I would argue that all politics are local, and that in this case, if we're going to be policing our communities, what gives us the power is the trust of those communities, the people within that community. And it's how we do it and how we interact with our public will determine whether or not they're pleased with the services we provide and accept the services we provide.
Congressman, thank you for the question. I'm going to start with the end first. I don't think it's a question of federalizing or nationalizing. I don't agree with that. But like any profession, whether you're an attorney, whether you're a doctor, the idea that the profession would not have national standards. I expect that no matter what hospital I go to in this country, that if the best evidence says you take out an appendix this way, that's what you're going to do. And the failure to do that and cause me harm would be malpractice. We have 18,000 agencies that are engaging in malpractice literally on a daily basis because of the lack of national standards. So the idea that you set national use of force standards, national standards for accountability, is not counter to the idea of decentralized or local policing. And your question about how do we get back to that, I got to push back just a little bit, Congressman, in saying that for many, this is not a question to get back to. The trust has never been there. It's just now visible. It's visible because of videos. It's visible because of marches and demonstrations. For many communities, the trust level has always been strained based on historic abuses and current practices. I think it goes to the question Congressman Richmond asked about how do you not know? I think they did know. But when we have policies and practices that tell the officers, you shall enforce the law so that these statistical crime rates that Ms. McDonald's talking about goes down, and CompStat, and you're sitting here now talking about crime and numbers of went up 10%, 2%, and ignoring the people that are involved is counterproductive. The idea that police themselves can reduce crime is false. It is completely false. We've had a lot of discussion here today, Congressman, about the issues of firearms, and not to get into the gun debate, but as a black male, I ask one simple thing. Isn't my body have more privilege than a gun? Why are we so willing to fight and push back on anything that would restrict the Second Amendment, but when it comes to the Fourth Amendment, the 14th, the seizure of my black body, there's all kinds of reasons to do it. We need to show respect to the communities and move forward.
The time of the gentleman has well expired. The gentleman from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mrs. Carr, for your grace and your very powerful words. Thank you for being with us. Mr. Blake, thank you for sharing your story. I'm sorry that you had that experience. I approach this from a kind of unusual perspective. I was a civil rights lawyer and criminal defense lawyer before I became mayor of Providence, and I think I was responsible for the greatest number of cases against the Providence Police Department, civil rights cases. I then became the public safety commissioner, and the Providence Police Department today is one of the best police departments in America. We went from a department that had 2 federal investigations, including a standard practices and standards investigation, to a fully accredited department and the lowest crime rate in 40 years. And what I learned in that experience is that, and my chief used to always say this, the most powerful weapon we have to reduce crime in the city is not any of our guns or other equipment, it's the trust of the community. And we built a community policing model that divided the city into substations where police officers walked beats in the neighborhood and built relationships with community leaders. But one of the early challenges was we didn't have a police department that reflected the diversity of the city it served. And I found that to be one of the most powerful ways to build that trust, that people saw people from their community that were in the department. And so I'm wondering, Chief, whether you have any ideas of what Congress can do to incentivize the diversity of departments, the recruitment, the retention, the challenges that face, particularly for communities that may have not historically been part of the police department that are interested, that what can we do as members of Congress to help departments work aggressively to reflect the diversity of the communities they serve?
You know, thank you for the question. That's a very great question because, trust me, not only am I thinking of different ways to recruit, to make it more diverse or to make it more open for the field of law enforcement alone, we're being affected drastically with not being able to recruit individuals. So in regards to what Congress can do, maybe incentivizing opportunities for funding, support. I know we had it in the past in regards to being able to recruit with a better salary. Of course, the equipment that's coming, that's being offered, that assists. But even if there's a think tank with other opportunities of incentives that can be offered, trust me, I'll be the first one to raise my hand and say I want to be a part of that to figure out what else we can do to recruit within our communities.
Thank you, Chief. My other experience is, and I think there's a recent study that confirmed this, I think everyone recognizes the vast majority of law enforcement officers are doing their job, doing it well, and never get enough credit for the good work that they do. And in fact, the number of incidents come from a very small number of members of each of these departments. And there was a recent article published called Good Cop, Bad Cop, Using Civilian Allegations to Predict Police Misconduct, advances the theory that a small minority of repeat offenders are responsible for the vast majority of misconduct within police departments. And if you consider in the case of Mr. Garner and Mr. Blake, the offending officers had previous misconduct complaints sustained against them. And so one of the things that we did in Providence was we created an early detection system. Because what we learned is that sometimes these things started off as small things which were evidence of something else going on in the officer's life, something at home, a substance abuse issue, a mental health issue. But it was an early system to detect that someone needed to intervene and find out what was going on to prevent a more serious charge. And so I'm wondering, anyone on the panel, whether or not though we might incentivize the creation of some of those early detection systems so we can prevent some of the things that are subject of today's hearings, and whether or not your experience is that it is in fact a small subset within most departments where the most problems persist. Reverend Sharpton or the Chief?
I would concur. It's called an early warning system, and most leading agencies have that. Being able to offer more incentives, more awareness, more training, not just for the system of if we have repeated complaints that come into our internal affairs unit or from the community, but other aspects, giving the supervisor the oversight within internally to be able to offer wellness issues, to be able to ask questions, what's going on. But you're correct, it is an early warning system that assists departments with identifying things that are outliers for those individual officers, and extra training as well.
I agree. I think that there clearly needs to be inside the departments, really under the supervisors, to monitor and really guide a lot of the behavior of the officers that they keep getting repeat complaints with, because those human factors outside of the job does bear a lot of what happens in the job, and the public I'm not saying in all cases, but could become the ones that bear the brunt of whatever situation they may be facing.
Yeah, and I'll just end where I began, and that is that this issue about the trust developed between the community and police is the key. And I knew we had been successful in the city of Providence when I drove down the street in one neighborhood and saw these two very big officers playing hopscotch with a little girl in the neighborhood, because they had become so much a part of that community and so respected. And I think that's one of the things that we can work on to provide resources so departments can build those trusting relationships between the police and the community. And with that, I yield back and thank the witness.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to everybody for being here. Commander Yos, I had a couple questions for you. First, I want to thank you for your long service in law enforcement, and congratulations on your well-deserved election as the National President of the Fraternal Order of Police.
Thank you.
You do, all of us in Louisiana, great service, and we're very proud of you, so thank you for that. You shared some statistics earlier today that I just think are really alarming, and I wanted to reiterate two of those. 66% reduction in the recruitment of new police officers nationwide. Is that what you said?
That's what I understand, yes.
And first responders have about a 5 times the rate of PTSD occurrence than the general population. I mean, these are things that are alarming and should.
I think, and this is the elephant in the room. We don't like talking about it because it's uncomfortable. But if you think about the demands that are placed on a person in the law enforcement profession, the shift work they work, the level of the calls that they respond to, the things that they see and the things that they deal with and try and compartmentalize within their own lives. All of that takes a toll on an individual. And for far too long, we refused to talk about it. We wanted them to be strong. We expect our officers to be strong. And it wasn't until we realized that we were doing a disservice by not recognizing the impact that it's having. Often we'll see officers that we think they're acting out. We think that they're bad officers. In a lot of cases, we really need to acknowledge the fact that there's a reason why there's some actions being taken. And it's signs. It's signs of something much greater than that. And I will argue, I feel very strongly of the fact that when someone subjects their life, their family, and everything to the profession of law enforcement to do good for within their community, we need to recognize these things, and we need to not push them aside. We need to find programs to help them and save those officers. We have a fiduciary and a moral responsibility to save that which has been broken in the service of our communities, and I think that's very important to recognize it, to focus on the fact that it does exist, and we need to tackle it. We need to give some serious consideration and thoughts to a holistic approach of saving officers who are damaged because of the type of work they're doing.
I appreciate you saying that. I grew up in the household of a first responder. My dad was a assistant chief, Shreveport Fire Department. He was permanently disabled, critically injured in a fire in 1984, and so I have a real appreciation of the danger that's faced by first responders. I grew up at the Fire and Police Training Academy because my dad was a training officer. And I heard a metaphor one time, and it's pretty well known now, but basically society's divided into three groups of people. There are sheep, which defines most people, not in a derogatory manner, but we're all peace-loving folks who wouldn't do harm to anybody else. There's a second category, it's the wolves, and these are the people, evil men and sociopaths that prey upon the innocent without mercy. And then there's a third category, and those are the sheepdogs. And the sheepdogs are called to protect the sheep and confront the wolves. And I am so grateful we have sheepdogs in our society. That's our law enforcement officers, military, first responders. Thank you all. Thank all of you that serve, because it is a thankless job. A couple of questions in the short time I have left. Commander Yost, I guess you first. Have you yourself or have you witnessed reduced reaction times by police officers confronted with violence because somewhere in their thought processes they're afraid of being fired or sued or prosecuted? And the second part is, if so, does that affect their safety and by extension the safety of innocent bystanders in the community at large?
I'll speak in general terms if I can.
Sure.
I know of having discussions with officers to where their decision to take action was delayed with the thought process of how it would affect their family. And so the good news is we were able to have that conversation because it turned out with a peaceful resolution. But I can also tell you that I know a number of officers who found themselves in situations where a non-compliance has escalated. And because we have the non-compliance and there's an escalation, then there's an uncertain outcome. That uncertain outcome affects a lot of people. It affects the officers, it affects the person that's having the encounter, and it also affects the bystanders. And what we need to do is we need to focus. We need to focus a tremendous amount of our energy on de-escalation techniques and training, because that really, when it comes to, we look at all of these situations, they've elevated to a point because it's escalated. And we definitely need to improve on our skills in order to de-escalate these because of the uncertain outcomes. At times, it can be irreversible.
I see heads nodding all across the table, and I think that's universally understood. Last question, short time left. Do you see policing ultimately as being the responsibility of police and government, or maybe also an obligation of the public as well?
Oh, it's clearly an obligation of the public and police. I think it's a partnership. Anything less would not be effective.
Thank you. I'm out of time. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this important hearing. Thank you all very much for being here. Ms. Carr, I want to thank you in particular for channeling your anger and your grief around the brutal killing of your son, Eric Garner, and giving inspiration with a mother's love, giving inspiration to the movement for justice and an end to this kind of violence. I deeply, deeply appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Blake, also for sharing your story. I wanted to start by saying that I think, and I think, Chief Davis, you mentioned this in your opening remarks, when we refuse to acknowledge the structural biases that are within our institutions, when we refuse to acknowledge the institutionalized racism that exists within all systems, here in government, in law enforcement, in every system. When we unfortunately have colleagues who mock and try to malign witnesses and discredit the idea that we are all working together to try to get to a solution here, but we have to acknowledge the biases that exist. If we don't acknowledge that white supremacy, if we don't acknowledge the history of institutionalized racism in this country, we cannot move forward. And I do believe that all of us, law enforcement, community, we do want, for the vast majority of people, we do want to find a way forward. I come to this, I represent Seattle, the Seattle area, but before being a member of Congress, I was a civil and immigrant rights leader, and we wrote to, I was a signatory to the letter that went to the Department of Justice asking for a patterns and practice investigation into use of force and police brutality, police violence in our community, and we got that. And I am deeply grateful for those pattern and practice investigations that the Department of Justice used to conduct. And I am sorry because we are still not through the process. It is not an easy process. We are not through it. I wish we could go to the Department of Justice for support. We can't do that right now. We also recently passed as a state a De-Escalate Washington initiative. And Ms. Carr, you'll be happy to know it came from the families of those who were killed, who came together and said, we have to take on what is one of the most restrictive laws in the country that essentially made it impossible to have any accountability in police shooting incidents because we needed to prove, according to our Constitution, a standard of malice that was essentially impossible. And you know what happened is those families got together with law enforcement and put together an initiative that also has had bumpy fits and starts, but was passed, and part of that included de-escalation. And I've heard, Mr. Yos, I know you just spoke about this, I saw Dr. Goff nodding, but part of what it did, in addition to changing the standard and making it very clear that we needed a different standard to hold police officers accountable, it also provided resources to the frontline officers, because I do think that our law enforcement is being forced to address issues on the front lines that are frankly the negligence of underfunding that the federal government has been doing, austerity spending that we have been doing that creates people who are homeless or creates, hunger or creates all kinds of issues in our communities. And so I wanted to ask, and maybe I'll direct this at both Chief Davis and Mr. Yos, do you support an approach to policing that encourages de-escalation and makes it clear that use of force is a last resort? Let me start with you, Chief Davis.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Yes, I do. I think a good policy to take a look is Camden, New Jersey, and also the Police Executive Research Forum 30 Guiding Principles, where that force should be a necessity. Right. And although it's a last resort, doesn't mean that sometimes that's the first option, that it should be proportionate, and that it should basically be with strong tactics of really sticking to time, distance, and cover. So yes, I do.
Mr. Yos, you want to add anything to that?
I agree that de-escalation is going to be a very big key of stopping or preventing things from hurling in a very unpredictable way, and we clearly need to focus as much energy as we can to increase that. I think that that there's no doubt that in instances, force is going to be required, and because of that, there needs to be a balance.
Thank you. I should have mentioned that the initiative had the support of law enforcement. The Black Law Enforcement Association of Washington and our local sheriff both endorsed that initiative. My last question, my remaining time, Ms. Garcia, as a former DOJ official in the Civil Rights Division, you conducted these investigations into law enforcement agencies to determine whether law enforcement actions were pattern and practice, and you helped to enforce consent decrees. In your experience, why is that DOJ oversight so critical for addressing excessive use of force of police?
Thank you. First of all, when DOJ initiates a pattern of practice investigation, it is because there has been such a severe breakdown at the state and local level to keep those departments accountable that they do need an outside federal agency to come and correct them. Once DOJ finds a systemic constitutional violations, the consent decrees that result are actually court enforceable and overseen by independent monitors. So that is what is crucial to correcting all the problems that come with the constitutional violations, everything from the training to the resources to the policies to officer wellness programs, and most importantly, the community engagement, because community engagement in that matter is really what's going to take hold and help see that through once DOJ is gone.
Thank you, and our federal monitor is playing a big role in that still. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentlelady from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all of you for being here today. I think both Republicans and Democrats would agree that we need to penalize bad actors and bad actions. But what I am concerned about today and also in the media is that the sole focus has been on the relatively small number of bad actors and bad actions. We heard it from our Chairman Nadler at his beginning statement. He listed a whole bunch of instances that were not a good outcome. And then we see on the screens all day today as we're talking just that. But how about all of the good things that law enforcement has done? I really think we need to focus on that too. And because of that, I want to give you some examples of good things that have happened just recently that law enforcement has done in Arizona. On August 26, first responders in Arizona, including the Arizona Department of Public Safety, rescued an 8-year-old girl who had fallen about 75 feet into Oak Creek Canyon in Arizona. On August 23rd, Arizona police officers rescued a baby left in a car in 100-degree heat for nearly an hour, and she survived. On August 6th, Tucson police officer spotted a kitten locked inside a car in Midtown parking lot on Saturday and rescued it. On July 11th, there was a fire at Mesa, Arizona apartment complex where officers bravely placed themselves in harm's way to rescue a family. In Phoenix, just the other day, there was a severe traffic collision where one of the motorists unfortunately lost his leg. Due to the quick thinking of the police officers who were first to arrive prior to medical units, his life was preserved by the makeshift tourniquet that was applied. And one of the things that the Phoenix police is doing now is they have their newest unit on the force is an ice cream truck. And they're using it in lower socioeconomic neighborhoods where they're concerned that there's a bad feeling about police officers, and so they're trying to mitigate it. Yesterday afternoon, a suspect entered a store full of customers and robbed the store at knife point. Then he fled the store, he carjacked another victim at knife point, and was arrested. You know, I'm just saying, we need to take care of bad actors, but let's not forget that our law enforcement are doing so many great things each and every day, so many heroic things, and I want to thank them for what they do. And I have a question for Mr. Yost. Previously, in previous testimony, one of the witnesses suggested that we support a bill that would prohibit chokeholds. And I just want your professional advice on that. If we prohibited chokeholds, would it then lead to not having an option on the table and you'd actually have to use lethal force more?
Well, it's a very complicated and fluid question asking for an outcome that's very much unpredictable. There's an escalation. The escalation causes actions, and it progresses up. At some point, there becomes an issue of whether or not what is necessary in order to maintain or to not lose control of a situation. So it's a very, very fluid concern. It's not an easy answer. And I'm not too sure I can answer that. I can just tell you that every time that we find ourselves in a situation where it escalates to a point where it becomes some physical altercation, then I think the outcomes are always going to be different.
And Mr. Yost, this has been touched on a little bit, but do you think all of this publicity and focus on negative actors actually hurts the morale of the law enforcement and causes problems with retention and hiring law enforcement officers?
No, ma'am, I don't think so. I know so. I think we're in a point now where it is easy to demonize law enforcement. Often it's done without knowing all of the facts. We're a nation of laws, and those laws have due process, and we're quick to rush to judgment on making assertions on what's happening. And I think it's creating an atmosphere in this country that is making it very difficult for law enforcement officers to do their job. We were once very respected. Now, as you mentioned, there are incidents that we certainly should be reviewed and handled, but it doesn't reflect on every law enforcement officer. But every law enforcement officer is taking a burden for it.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, I'd like to yield any time I had left to Mr. Gates.
Chairman, I'm unanimous consent request.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Demings.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses who are here today. As I've listened to your testimony, I feel very hopeful about the subject that we are discussing today. This is a serious topic, and some of the statements today have been helpful, and some have been downright disgraceful and shameful. I think through all of the yelling and carrying on that we've seen, the theatrics, some of my colleagues forgot that Ms. Carr was in the room. They forgot there were other families in the room who lost their loved ones. And so on their behalf, because I know they forgot, I want to say we are sorry for your loss. We're talking about a profession that I loved, a profession that I worked in for 27 years. My first floor speech as a member of Congress, I thought it would be about health care or some other topics. It ended up being about a female sergeant, an African-American sergeant who I promoted as the chief of police, who was shot and killed trying to arrest a murder suspect who had shot and killed his pregnant girlfriend. I worked with some of the finest men and women who wear the badge. Good police officers are like my family, but we've had some problems. And we have an obligation, Republicans, Democrats, and every person in this room, to work to make sure that police officers are celebrated, but bad cops are held accountable. The ranking member said it correctly, that there is no one who wants to get rid of bad cops more than good cops do. And I can tell you, as a former chief of police, I spent every doggone day trying to get rid of the bad cops. We wear the badge, law enforcement wears the badge over our hearts. And we wear the badge over our hearts as a constant reminder that you have to have the heart for the job, right? That we're dealing with people and families. Mr. Yoles, Captain Yoles, you talked about what the men and women go through. It's a tough job. I know it's tough from having done it. But if we're going to save this profession and get it back to the level which it deserves to be, we have got to work together to do that. I don't have a question for you today, but when I hear the discussion about federal what role can the federal government play? When we talk about leaving it up to individual states, that scares me. We tried that with the Voting Rights Act, and look what's happening. I do believe the federal government can play a direct role in helping to create standards. Doesn't matter whether you're one officer department, 4 officer, 1,000 or 30,000. When you put on that badge and the gun, the standards in which you police with, there should be standards. And I believe you said it, Chief Davis, that if you were going for any other profession, there are some minimum standards that you should have. Hiring standards. Do we want anybody doing the job of a law enforcement officer, one where he or she will be out there on the streets by themselves making life and death decisions? We want the brightest and the best, and every agency should spend their time trying to hire the best and the brightest men and women to do the job. We know it's going to cost Ms. Carr to do that, but we need to work together and see how we can get it done. With training standards, We not only want the brightest and the best, Captain, we want the best training so that when our men and women, if we want them to survive, not just physically, but to survive their jobs and not be in front of a courtroom, then we have to give them the tools to survive. And training is one of those tools. Use of force training, standardized training that involves use of force across the nation. And then community partnerships. I can tell you in Orlando, where I served as a chief, we would not have survived. I went to the community every time we had a good day and every time we had a bad day and asked the community to help me create a police department that knew how to police the community in which they serve. So I feel, I don't have a question, Mr. Chairman. I feel extremely hopeful today if we continue to work together. And I believe the people in this room who have endured and are still here want to get this done. So I thank you. God bless you all. Thank you very much.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Florida has a unanimous consent request to admit a document. Without objection, the document will be admitted. We've just called votes on the floor, but I hope we can finish so we don't have to come back. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you. I do want to thank Ms. Carr and Mr. Blake for being here and for all the families who are here to represent their experiences. I also want to thank the law enforcement officers who do lay their lives on the line every day, including former Chief Demings, for their commitment to excellence, because I think that's what we're all looking for here. Representative Demings talked about the tools that we need our law enforcement officers to have. As a representative from Philadelphia, I'm both familiar with and a huge supporter of the robust, community-oriented policing work of Charles Ramsey, who was the former police chief in Philly and DC, and then, of course, was one of the co-chairs of the 2015 Presidential Task Force, I guess it was, on 21st century policing. That report, which I think is an excellent document to guide us forward, and I wish we'd been able to work more robustly with that already. It set forth 6 core principles, starting with a broad challenge to change the culture of policing, but also including attention to officer wellness and safety and cutting-edge technology. So in the limited time and with votes coming, I wanted to focus on some of the tools that the Department of Justice has used in the past, which aren't currently available, and they were sort of a carrot and a stick. Ms. Garcia, can you comment on the impact of the Department of Justice's reversal of policy regarding consent decrees and how that makes it more difficult for the DOJ to obtain court enforcement agreements to stop civil rights abuses? And this would be the carrot that could be held over a police force that perhaps was not meeting its obligations to the public.
So Jeff Sessions' memo that he issued on the last day that he was overseeing DOJ severely undercut the efficacy of consent decrees by doing things such as placing time limitations on them of a couple years and really stripping the discretion of the career attorneys from crafting the remedies that are necessary for systemic reform. They're the folks that are doing the fact-finding inquiry and talking to the communities and really handling the investigations. They're not political appointees, so they're really in the best position to actually deliver justice to the communities that need it because of all the systemic violations that have occurred.
Okay, and I understand the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights has also been critical of that decision. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. Mr. Davis, I also wanted to focus, though, on the carrot, which was the opportunity for police forces to request assistance, because the 2 major cities in my district, Philadelphia and Chester, both reached out and participated in the COPS CRI-TI program. Yes. In Chester, there was a police shooting after a suspect was chased, and the man was killed after 100 bullets were pumped into his car. So there was community outrage. There had been a series of police-involved shootings, but that police department reached out and requested help. My understanding is that the Department of Justice has ended that program, which was designed to provide advice and recommendations on how police departments could do a better job of engaging their community. Can you talk about that?
Yes, what the department has done was they remain that there's a critical collaborative reform program, but it no longer does the type of organizational assessments. And Philadelphia is a perfect example. We went into Philadelphia and spent close to a year at the commissioner's request, looking from top to bottom at use of force training policies, and found some serious deficiencies in training, found some deficiencies on what we call threat perception failures, that there were racial disparities when people were perceived to have a gun but didn't and were shot anyway. And by changing policies and training in response, when the commissioner left, shootings, officer-involved shootings, were down almost 50%. We did the same thing with Chester Technical Assistance. For a lot of departments, the chief would call us saying, look, I really want to find out what's going on in the department. I need to find out, what I need to fix, and could you help? That is no longer there, which means they're going to keep operating, making the same mistakes, and depending on the size of the organization, there could be some systemic challenges or failures that may take years to get to the point where they're going to fix them, but that's usually after a lot of victims. So, I would strongly recommend that such a program be brought back. And it's a good carrot to what Linda's talking about, which is for the agencies that can't reform, that won't reform, and the leadership's not committed to reform, you need a consent decree. Some are prepared, they want to do it, the leadership's there, the community's working with them, then you can help them get there in the most efficient way.
Okay, and I would be wholly supportive of having multiple tools. So thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentlelady from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do want to thank all the witnesses for being here, and I apologize that I've had to step out a lot during this hearing, but we have a markup next door in financial services where my vote was needed. Mr. Chairman, the relationship between law enforcement and the community is a very important one, which is supposed to promote the safety and well-being of all people. As awareness and activism increases, so must our commitment to a vision for public safety that honors the humanity of all people. Throughout my career, I've spent time with community members, local leaders, and police officers. I was the founding chair of the Independent Police Oversight Board, appointed by former Mayor Elise Parker in Houston. So I'm familiar with the issues that involve the relationship between law enforcement and the communities they're supposed to protect. Houston Chief of Police Art Acevedo testified in this committee earlier this year. He shared that the Hispanic community has suffered a chilling effect in reporting violent crimes since 2017 when our anti-immigrant racial profiling bill, SB 4, became law. Unfortunately for many of us in Houston and some other parts of the country, the old driving while black has now turned into driving while brown. We have seen that even that more against some of our anti-immigrant community. This Texas law forces local governments and law enforcement agencies to act as federal immigration officers. It diverts limited resources away from the communities, corrodes public trust in law enforcement, and drive witnesses and victims of crime into the shadows. According to Chief Acevedo, undocumented immigrants and even lawful immigrants are now even afraid to report crime. In Houston, women advocates, domestic violence shelter workers, and immigrants shared stories of women who are now afraid of contacting law enforcement because of deportation threats and threats of abuse. Across the USA, authorities have documented declines in crime reported by immigrants. The pain and frustrations are real. We're facing serious challenges in solving the erosion of trust between the police and communities, so we must do more. I thank the witnesses who have come here today, and I hope that working together we can work on national standards and guidelines and policies to ensure that when it comes to public safety, all will be protected. I want to start with you, Ms. Garcia, and I don't start with you because you're a cousin, because I've not met you before. I want to start with you. I read with some interest you handed out this book, and I wanted to refer to you on the use of police oversight boards. Like I said, I started the one in Houston under the guidance of Mayor Parker. Others call them police civilian review boards, and you did list it in your book as one of the tools that would help among, I guess, 14 or 15 others. How many cities are doing that, and are they working? and then we've only got less than 2 minutes.
Hi. In terms of whether they're working, they're actually one of the biggest tools for community engagement and transparency, for the community to be involved in that oversight process. And so they're extremely important, actually, in your home state, Dallas. Just recently, the chief there worked with local community coalition to institute a community oversight review board. So they're really an important step, and we would encourage that they actually have the ability to also recommend discipline. Some of them don't. In terms of the numbers, I would have to get back to you on the total number across the country.
Okay, and I would ask the chief over there, sir, in your experience and in your discussions with others, your colleagues, are we seeing an increase not only in the impact of the influence of the new white supremacy rhetoric and things that are going, not only that are anti-Jewish, anti-Black, anti-people of color, anti-immigrant, in terms of what is going on, even in policing?
Yes, I think we're seeing an increase in hate crime and violence external in the community. We're seeing, quite frankly, a infiltration of white supremacists into law enforcement, which is also a challenge. And so we are seeing that.
How can we get at that, though? I guess that's, you've made my point. I mean, how can we, what do we do other than the cultural training and things that some of the grants can do so we can make sure that we get that element out of policing?
So one of the things I found when I was in the administration, there's still significant underreporting of hate crimes. When you look at the numbers, you got a whole state that may say they had 5 hate crimes. So making sure there's clarity of exactly what is and is not a hate crime. Making sure officers are treating hate crimes for the severity that they represent. Inside police departments, making sure that we do thorough background investigations that go to their culture. Most agencies do it, but they can't be superficial. They need to do character references so that they can find out some of the views. And today, it can even be on social media and others to make sure that the person you're hiring for this job, as Chief Demings mentioned, Congresswoman Demings mentioned, is prepared to make these independent life and death scenarios.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. There are 3 minutes and 50 seconds left for votes on the floor, but there are 321 people who haven't voted yet. So I think we can have one more witness now. One more question. The gentlelady from Florida. From Georgia, I'm sorry. From Georgia.
Thank you, Chairman, and I don't have any questions today, so I will be brief, but I do have a statement I'd like to make. Thank you, each and every one of you today, for being here today. It's vitally important, and I know that I was running back and forth between other hearings as well, but I definitely wanted to make sure that I was here today. And I want to give an exceptional thank you and welcome to Mama Gwen, as I call her, Ms. Gwen Carr. She and I have worked together as one of the mothers of the movement, traveling around the country on this very vitally important issue. And your testimony was powerful and just so invaluable. And I'll say more about that in just a minute. First, I want to say how much I appreciate the law enforcement officers who do put their lives on the line every day for the communities that they serve. And those officers who serve their communities with the dignity and respect that they deserve. Our officers do face difficult situations, and we must empower them to respond appropriately. It is imperative we give them evidence-based training in implicit bias. We must also invest in community-based policing. Most importantly, we must hold individuals accountable when they abuse the power that we, the people, have given them. No doubt we have more work to do to build bridges that connect law enforcement and our communities. Our communities must respect law enforcement as our protectors, not the enemy. But our police must continually earn that respect. Police cannot see their communities as the enemy either. Rather, they must respect the human dignity of every person that they encounter, even and especially when it is challenging for them to do so. That is much easier when our law enforcement officers look like the communities that they serve and see that community as their brothers, their sisters, and their neighbors. When that fails to happen, the costs are great. We know this from the personal stories that we've heard today, and we also know it from the data. A 2017 study of over 1,100 lawsuits against law enforcement, the largest study of its kind to date, found that our legal framework for these cases, the doctrine of qualified immunity, is not even achieving its stated goals. It is often raised as a defense at a trial, not in the early stages of litigation as it was intended. Of course, the human toll is the most significant reason for the need for reform, but the financial costs are also significant. Contrary to what you might hear, a study found that taxpayers ultimately pay for 99.98% of the amount paid to victims and families when an officer abuses his or her power. Those who abuse their power often serve no time and don't pay families a single cent for the immeasurable harms they have caused. But not enough can ever be said about the lives that we have lost when officers dehumanize and devalue the life of another person. And I want to say to my mother's sister, I want to say to her, as I call her Mama Gwen, thank you for sharing your story, a story of injustice you and your family and your son, Eric Garner, should never have ever had to bear. And we will keep fighting for Eric. We will honor his memory and all those that are taken from us by abuses of power. We will not forget Eric, and we will not forget the stories of those who are speaking out. Mama Gwen, your voice is truly a catalyst for change, and I thank you for that. I speak to you, mother to mother, and I hope that we can make sure that not another person ever bears the pain of losing a child, such as you have or such as I have. Until you suffer the death of your child, you can never truly understand the depth of inequity and inequality that we still face in this country. And I vow to you that we will take action. We will hold people accountable when they have the power to do right and choose instead to devalue life. And when our systems are failing to those who abuse power, and when our systems are failing to hold those who abuse power accountable, we must see to it that these systems change. It is imperative our law enforcement and our citizens work together to build the trust, the respect, and the community that every American in this country deserves. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The lady yields back. Gentlelady from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much to the witnesses for coming here and to all of you in the audience. I know that you come here today to this hearing seeking justice, seeking equal treatment. It is okay to have these conversations despite what you hear from some of the minority party on the other side. It is not just okay to have this conversation. I think it is incredibly important for us to have this conversation today and all over America, because the facts are that people of color are affected by acts of police brutality 2 to 4 times more than others. I represent a district, it's a majority district, and we have had those issues, but I also want to point out that I have met many members in law enforcement whom I respect greatly, who understand the intricacies of our communities and who have been working so hard to build the trust, which I think is so important. We know that there's tension between communities and law enforcement, and we have seen through now phones and social media, which has light on the lack of trust between the police and the populations that they serve. And I think that most importantly, we need to start building trust. But we can't do that without acknowledging that there's inherent racism in this country. We can't do that if we can't have an honest conversation, which is why I think it's such an important moment for us to discuss this here today. So police involvement is more than just enforcing the law. It's more than just making arrests. I think that it is important to start building trust in these communities.
bringing police officers together to shape, to build an understanding of one another. And we have started those programs. I'm very proud to share with you that in my district, in Goulds and in the Hammocks, which are communities in my district, police district regularly puts on events designed to get cops acquainted with the city's residents. Police Major Michael Dayepa and his deputies hold regular coffee with cops at local restaurants, and they schedule bike rides around different neighborhoods to engage with the people that they're protecting. Events like these help foster a real and open relationship in vastly different communities. At a federal level, I think that it is our duty to make sure that community policing initiatives are fully funded and continue to succeed. Sadly, though, many of the essential federal programs have been cut or pushed out of the existence under the current administration. So my first question is to Chief Davis. Given the cuts to federal community cops program over the past couple of years, especially the technical assistance program, what recommendations do you have for local communities and police departments to continue to build these relationships, even with, as we see, more decreased federal funding?
Thank you for the question. I will say in many cases, Congresswoman, states have been stepping up. So in California, Illinois, where the Department of Justice walked away either from a consent decree or from a collaborative reform, the state attorney generals have stepped in. And so I think you go to the state level. I would still talk to agencies, as Chief Hawkins mentioned, the agencies that have experience and have the best practices, and get engaged with the national associations and organizations that are working to establish these national best practices. There definitely are significant gaps, but they can be filled in. The real challenge for many communities is all of the technical assistance provided was at no cost to that jurisdiction. So small or large can have access to it. The challenge now is most agencies now have to go out and pay for consultants, pay for that technical assistance, so it becomes a challenge. But they can probably turn to their state, turn to their associations, and turn within their own group to understand what are the best practices.
Thank you for that. And Mr. Goff, as members of Congress, what do you think we can do or bring back to our communities to optimize the relationship between law enforcement and the communities that they serve?
It's a great question. Thank you for it. I would say that the Department of Justice have put forward an initiative that just concluded, the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice. The goal of that initiative was to take the science that we already knew worked in the laboratory and in one-off and do it in 6 cities across the United States, from focused deterrence to racial reconciliation to both training and culture shifts in procedural justice to training and culture shifts and the use of data to reduce racially disparate elements. So given the time, I'll say it's in the proposal and in the record.
Thank you, Mr. Goff.
Yep.
Yield back my time.
Dr. Goff, I'm impressed by the remarkable work you're doing to advance community safety. The question that's been running through my mind is how America's vast and quite unique problem of gun violence complicates the problem of police-civilian relations. We've lost more than 1.5 million of our citizens since 1968 to gun violence. The rates of gun violence in America are 25 times higher than 22 other wealthy countries on average. So this must be a very serious problem in terms of community civil relations, and I wonder if you would opine on that.
Sadly, there's not as much good research on exactly that question as there should be. But I can tell you the things that we know both from the science and from mine and CPE's exposure to law enforcement, which is, of course, it has a huge impact on it. If you look at Chief Art Acevedo in Houston, who every time there is a shooting understands that his officers are going out to a place where you can't escalate by simply putting hands on somebody because they might be armed, right? But I think one of the elements that we're not talking about nearly enough is that just as much as gun violence, shooting other people, homicides, makes the job of law enforcement infinitely more dangerous, it's suicides that are responsible for a larger proportion of lost officer lives, right? So we have to go back to officer wellness to talk about it. So both as they're going out on the jobs and then as they're having to metabolize it and live with it at home, the availability of guns and gun violence are epidemic, not just on the streets, but in the private homes of law enforcement as well.
Thank you. Can I ask one yes or no question? Okay, and I think this is for Chief Davis. You mentioned the problem of white supremacists entering police forces, and we've certainly heard reports of that. Do you have any research suggesting that this is actually a conscious strategy by white supremacist groups to send people in to local police forces?
No, sir, just anecdotes at this time.
To submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record, we thank our witnesses. That objection, the hearing is adjourned. There is 0 time left for vote. It's on the floor.